All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Biohazard Declassified podcast. I'm very grateful you tuned in today. We are once again entering the survival horror with Mr. CVX Freak himself, the author of Itchy Tasty, an unofficial history of the Resident Evil book, Alex Aniel. How you doing, Alex?
Hey, good morning. Good to be here.
Indeed. So, the main topic of discussion today, we spoke about it on our podcast extensively the first time round. The time's come. The time's come. The book is going to be released to Unbound backers in a couple of days now. What are your thoughts heading into the release of your book?
It's been a long time coming for sure. This book took about 4 years from when I decided to do it to when it's finally coming out. And that's about 3 years longer than I thought it would take. So I am extremely relieved that, in 2 days, it'll finally be in people's hands for real. So I look forward to seeing people's reactions.
And as an overview, if people are tuning into the first time, if you could give us an elevator pitch on what Itchy Tasty is and kind of the origins of it. If you could fire away and give us your best summary.
Sure. Itchy Tasty is a development-focused history of the first 10 years of Resident Evil. And I break it up into that because there's a lot to talk about even within just those first 10 years. And I think because a lot of the creators from the first decade have already left Capcom, it was actually easiest to get the most interesting details out of them. I try to tell a story that kind of goes from beginning to end, that spans all across the games that were in development for those 10 years. And I try to, create a narrative of how, one thing in Resident Evil development flowed right into another, and a lot of decisions made at one point had a lot of influence later on. So I'm really hoping, or actually I'm interested to see what the feedback to that is going to be, and if people find it to be an interesting way to tell the development, to tell the story of the development of such a long-lasting game series like Resident Evil.
And as we know, Resident Evil is on the cusp of hitting 25 years, which I imagine for some developers is absolutely flown by. Why Resident Evil? Out of all of the games in the world, and this may dive into nostalgic or personal feelings, but why Resident Evil? Why did you choose to base your book around this? And why is it one of your favorite franchises?
Yeah, I mean, I think to invest so much time into a project like this does require you to have a lot of personal investment in the subject matter. So obviously, I'm a huge Resident Evil fan. I wasn't there from day one, unfortunately. I first played Code Veronica in 2000, so I was at the time, I felt like I was late to the party in a lot of ways. Now, I consider myself one of the earlier fans, given that, it's been 25 years. So, yeah, I would say, I don't know if I could have written a book on anything else, really, because I don't have the level of familiarity with the production process of other game franchises that I happen to like. Like if I had to write a book about another franchise, maybe the Mario series would be the one that I would do. But even then, there's so much Mario stuff out there, not just from a video game standpoint, but from merchandising and all sorts of things. But even then, I feel like writing a book about Nintendo is a lot harder because Nintendo's very secretive about things like this, talking about development and such, unless they do it on their terms, like with the old Iwata Asks interviews, right? I feel like it's hard to get stuff beyond that without Nintendo playing ball. And I know from what I've heard around that they're not so open to the idea of books like these. Whereas, people at Capcom and people who used to work there are a lot more flexible to work with. So I think it was a matter of my personal investment in Resident Evil and the fact that it was definitely more feasible to do a book for this franchise than it would be for other big ones.
So you've spoken about the developers being flexible, more flexible than say if it was another IP. How did it come about getting into contact? Because one of the big selling points I feel with this books is you almost get this unfettered access to the original developers of Resident Evil, which for me and other old school Resident Evil fans is absolutely surreal. How did that initially come about?
Well, I work in the game industry in my regular in my job, so I already did have a few connections there. I also live in Tokyo, so I do have I live in the same country as all the developers who were originally from Japan, so that helped out a lot. And I speak the language, so I can talk to them directly. In terms of getting in touch with them, I would say, maybe a good 3/4 of it was actually through connections by other fans in the Resident Evil community. There are people out there like Newsbot who connected me with certain people. Paul, I think, right? And there are the people at oh gosh, I'm blanking on the names of all these fan sites right now. It's 8:30 a.m. on a Saturday in Tokyo, so my brain's not 100% working. Like connections through, well, sure. Oh my god, the Crimson Head podcast. There we go. They were
big fans of the Crimson Head podcast. Excuse me.
So yeah, I owe it to a lot of other fans who reached out to these people before I even did, and they got me connected. So I'm really grateful to them. There are a few people that I got in touch with on my own, but that's actually the minority, I would say. So,
but from a general point of view, was it reasonably simple to get hold of these developers? I mean, some of them may or may not. Again, I'm only speculating. May or may not have left the game industry or moved on to pastures new or different studios. Was it a simple task to get hold of them for the most part?
Yeah, 99% of them, absolutely. The one interview that I had to be I didn't have to be anything. Well, the one interview where I definitely had to make sure that the right people were informed and that the right channels were followed was the interview with Shinji Mikami, actually, because he works at Tango Gameworks, which is a subsidiary of Bethesda, and now it's a subsidiary of Microsoft. So I had to make sure that I was in contact with those with the people at Bethesda, but they were very nice in helping get the interview set up. So I'm really grateful that despite the interview not strictly being related to anything Mikami was doing at Tango at the time, that they were gracious enough to allow for the interview.
Brilliant. And I want to be tactful on how I approach this next question. The use of the term Resident Evil in your book, like even on the cover, how receptive have Capcom been as a brand? And again, I don't expect you to go into a lot of detail, but have they generally been open to the concept of Itchy Tasty?
Yeah, they've been collaborative to the extent that they're willing to allow, and I would say it's a fair arrangement. Obviously, this is an independent endeavor, and as such, Capcom doesn't officially endorse anything that I say, and that the book at the end of the day is exclusively my opinion, which I think is fair, because I do think my opinion is as truthful as my understanding can account for. Yeah, they contacted me a few times about the book just to make sure that our understandings were aligned, and that I wasn't passing this book off as something that it wasn't. Right? I mean, I do again assert that this book is accurate as far as my research can support. But the reality is, when you're talking to so many people and you're trying to piece together a history that is interpreted by dozens, if not hundreds of people, there could be differences of interpretation or differences of recollection. People can have different opinions about how things went down. People might have forgotten or misremembered. And, it's inevitable that, I'm expecting like some interview to pop up at some point later on down the line that might contradict what's in my book because, the person that I spoke to might have not remembered correctly, or again, there could have been a difference of opinion. So I've been very careful in trying to convey the fact that this book does have a certain degree of inevitable subjectivity to it, if that makes sense to you.
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Go on, Jesse.
But having said that, so you've interviewed everybody that's in the book over the first 10 years of Resident Evil's development. You've had unprecedented access to all of this. Out of that, what was your favorite point of that when as you're structuring the book? At what point did you get most excited to cover a certain part of this project?
Sorry,
I know that's kind of a loaded question because I'm sure as a mega fan, it's like, well, the whole thing.
No, that's a great question, Jesse. Actually, I'm laughing because my answer would be the interview with Yoshiki Okamoto. A lot of people know him as one of the creators of Street Fighter, or not the creator of Street Fighter per se, but he was the producer when Street Fighter 2 came out. So he was a very big presence in the company. He was one of the top dogs, and people have very colorful opinions of him in a good way because he's a very funny guy. And now, a lot of people might know him here in Japan for Monster Strike. But anyway, I was able to interview him, and he by far had the funniest interview because he was a lot more forthcoming about the more I don't want to say unsavory. That might sound a little too negative about the quote unquote, the scandalous sides of game development, right? Like the politics and, how decisions are made and how, people react to, to announcements and whatnot. So, I mean, I don't want to go into too much detail because the book's coming out and I do think it's an exciting read, but I mean, Okamoto described to me how Sony reacted when Capcom decided that Resident Evil would be exclusive to GameCube. And I thought that was a very funny and amusing thing to hear about. And I do talk about it in the book. So it's probably something that I'm very curious to see if people found it as funny as I did. So, yeah.
Well, the whole thing with Nintendo, because if I remember correctly, that was something that wasn't actually supposed to be exclusive, but ended up being exclusive because somebody said it was going to be. Or I know that's an oversimplified version of what actually happened, but to my understanding that was why a lot of games didn't have the exclusively for GameCube branding in certain regions.
Well, with Resident Evil, originally it was only supposed to be Resident Evil 0 that was exclusive to Nintendo. I know like when they announced that Resident Evil 0 foreign remake would come to GameCube only, it sounded like they had some grand ambition, like some grand, long, like something that had been in the oven for a long time. But it was actually, I would say 50% accident, 50%, taking advantage of an opportunity. Well, like I said, Resident Evil 0 was the only one that was exclusive at first. And then because Resident Evil 0 was developed by a team that had very little to do with Mikami himself, right? Mikami was the lead of Production Studio 4 at the time. And Resident Evil 0 was being developed by a different team at Production Studio 3. So it was the top level management at Capcom's decision to put a Resident Evil out on N64 exclusively, and then they moved it to GameCube. So Mikami's plans with Resident Evil 4 were separate from that, and that was originally supposed to be PlayStation 2, but that game became Devil May Cry, as we all know. And as far as I understand, Mikami decided that he wanted to put Resident Evil 4 on GameCube as well, because they had a lot of difficult times developing Devil May Cry 1 on PS2. And I think Mikami thought that with the GameCube coming, that the industry would shift more back toward Nintendo, and Sony might not be a gaming company for very long. And he acknowledges that he was wrong about that, but at the time, that's how he felt. And he wanted to support the company that he felt had the most to offer to gaming as a medium, right? So he, with the GameCube being easier to develop for and a little more powerful than PS2, Mikami decided that was where he wanted to take Resident Evil 4. So that meant there were 2 Resident Evil games on GameCube, right? 0 and 4. And coincidentally, I don't know who came up with this idea, but apparently to bridge the gap between Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 4, because I think both games at the time were supposed to explore the progenitor virus. That's right? Yeah, both games were supposed to talk about the progenitor virus. So 0 and 4 would have a relationship in that regard. But
yeah, you're right.
To bridge the gap, I think they said, they needed to port Resident Evil Code Veronica to GameCube as well. So they decided to do that. And then they also decided, well, if we're going to have Code Veronica on GameCube, we should put 2 and 3 on there as well. And then they realized one day, well, we have to put the first game on there as well. And then so they're like, well, the first game's really old. I don't think we should just port that. And then it turns out that, in order for Mikami's team to become more familiar with the GameCube hardware, in order to develop Resident Evil 4, which they wanted to be very different from the rest of the series, they needed to do a test run on a different project. So that test run became Resident Evil Remake, right? It was a relatively quick project to develop because it's based on the original game, so they had a lot of the design from that they could carry over to save time. They could figure out how the engine works and then take that technology and either make Resident Evil 4 or and also take that technology and use it for Resident Evil 0 as well. So yeah, that's kind of how the whole GameCube thing happened, right? And then the marketing people came in later and spun that into like an exclusivity thing, even though it was never technically true anyway, right? Like Resident Evil Outbreak was already in development for PS2 at the time. So
yeah, like from what I understand, it was more of like a handshake, like gentleman's agreement more than it was like an actual like fleshed out contractual agreement.
I've asked this to multiple people, and apparently for this specific thing there was no agreement, right? Because all these games were negotiated at different times anyway, right? So
right.
it wouldn't have made sense to me, knowing how like this stuff works, because I do biz dev in the game industry, which includes like reviewing contracts and signing contracts and whatnot. For there have been an agreement that encompassed Resident Evil 1, 0, and 4, because those were all decided at different times for different reasons. And I think I believe Mikami and all the other people when they say that wasn't an agreement that Nintendo specifically paid for. Now, to be fair, I think it's more common for those kinds of things to be true now, like for exclusivity agreements to kick in. Like I know with Resident Evil 7, obviously Sony had an agreement with Capcom for VR exclusivity, and I think the PS Vita version of Revelations 2 was also something that Sony decided to fund and develop as well. So it happens now, but I think back then, I've asked like 10 people about the Nintendo arrangement, and nobody said that Nintendo actually paid for it. So I think that's convincing enough for me.
On the note about, sorry, Jesse, on the note about consoles, and it's something I wanted to bring up last time, and it slipped my mind. We know that Capcom developed for the PlayStation 2 and the Nintendo GameCube, and they did develop Dino Crisis 3 for the Xbox. Why was Capcom so reticent to port Resident Evil to the Xbox? Because they had it on the Dreamcast. Resident Evil 2, 3, and Code Veronica, I believe it was, that were on the Dreamcast. It made, to me, total sense to then port that to the Xbox, the direct Xbox. It should be relatively simple to port over. Why, if you have any knowledge on that, why was Capcom so reticent to port Resident Evil to the original Xbox?
I think it was just bad timing. I don't think that anybody specifically didn't want Resident Evil on Xbox. I just think at the time, multi-platform development was far less common than it is today. And the reason for that is multi-platform game engines were not a thing back then, or were not a mainstream technology that Capcom had easy access to. So every port of any Resident Evil game between 1 and 4, you look at Resident Evil 1 on Saturn and you look at Resident Evil 1 on PlayStation. They all share the same development assets, but I think they all have different code running under the hood because the platforms were so different, and you had to rebuild games to run on different platforms. And that was still very much true as we went into the GameCube, Xbox, and PlayStation 2 era. So I think, Resident Evil Remake 0 and 4 were GameCube titles, and Capcom committed that to being GameCube only. So that obviously meant the Xbox couldn't get those games. And I imagine no one would have been interested in a port of Code Veronica for that system without anything else coming to it. And I mean, I think if Capcom were further along with their ambitions for multi-platform development, maybe the Outbreak games would have come to Xbox. But like even the Outbreak games came out not too long before the Xbox 360 succeeded the original Xbox. So I think ultimately it came down to a combination of the first Xbox's short lifespan. It was only 4 years between that and the 360, and Capcom's lack of ability to do a lot of simultaneous multi-platform releases, day one multi-platform releases. So I think that's just really what happened. I do know that Capcom's official policy back in the day, well, they had this 5-3-2 ratio. Was it 5-3-2 or 6-3-1? I think it was 5-3-2, right? If you have 10 games, right, 5 of them will be for PlayStation 2. 3 of them would be for either GameCube or Game Boy Advance, and two of them would be for Xbox. That doesn't sound right. Well, I think that might have been the ratio that Okamoto told me. But yeah, officially PlayStation was supposed to get half of Capcom support in any scenario, and then Nintendo would get 30%, and Microsoft, and I guess PC as well, would be 20%. So,
because if I'm not mistaken, the reason why a lot of I'm not saying it's the full reason, but with the Dreamcast, were almost direct PC ports of the game, if I'm not mistaken. Which would have made it really easy. They were putting on PC. They could directly port it to the Dreamcast, which again, though, begs the question of why didn't they just, because I mean, obviously I know like Xbox's hardware runs slightly different than a Microsoft computer, but from what I understand is like when the 360 came out, especially, that's why it had the initial jump in that era of the console war. Because it was so much easier for developers to develop on Microsoft, since the majority of them were already creating games friendly to Microsoft in the first place. So it still is funny that PlayStation, the more proprietary, harder to work with software, got more of the exclusives than, the same people that make the computer you're building the games on.
Yeah, I mean, that became true later on. And obviously, Microsoft being an American technology-focused company, they were the ones who kind of got that ball rolling. That wasn't something I would say that the Japanese game industry as a whole decided was the right thing to do. It was kind of forced on them in a lot of ways. And, it's worth remembering now that PlayStation is run largely out of the United States rather than Japan. So, the way this is all done, if you look at the situation back then in the modern context, it might not make a lot of sense, but it ultimately comes down to the fact that the PlayStation was by far the biggest game platform at the time, and it's counterparts were the Sega Saturn, which didn't sell well at all and was extremely hard to develop 3D games for. And the other one was the N64, and that was obviously, limited by the capacity and the high cost of N64 cartridges. So, the birth and the rise of Resident Evil does largely, coincide with the rise of the original PlayStation.
Sure.
So, yeah, it was very much a marketing motivated thing, I would say. And obviously, when the 360 rolled around, Capcom, supported that even before it launched. I think Resident Evil 5 was announced for it before launch. So I would say that the Xbox was always something that Capcom wanted to support, but it's just that the timing for the original hardware itself, wasn't quite right for making something like that happen.
No, it's funny though, talking about the rise of Resident Evil, greatly coinciding with the rise of Sony, and it's to me it's interesting to ponder upon what if Nintendo and Sony wouldn't have had their following out, where Nintendo decided to partner with Philips instead of Sony for the disk drive system, and as we all know, the PlayStation was the end result of that, and the 64 disk drive just never really actually happened. So it would be interesting to see where Nintendo would be in the modern console era had PlayStation never been able to rise, because it would have been a Nintendo property versus a Sony property.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's something that's very interesting to think about. But I do think it's worth mentioning, and I'm sure I've talked about this before, but Tokuro Fujiwara was the person who made Sweet Home happen at Capcom, and even after that game came out in 1989, he always wanted horror games to become their own genre. So it wasn't the PlayStation itself that convinced him to go greenlight Resident Evil 1. It was the fact that he saw Virtua Fighter, a Sega game, and Star Fox, a Nintendo game, running with full polygons, before he realized that there could be another opportunity to bring horror games to life with 3D hardware, 3D console hardware. And so, yeah, I would say the PlayStation was definitely responsible for the series becoming popular and possible to develop. I would also credit Nintendo and Sega for giving Fujiwara the spark that he needed to actually go and think about doing it seriously again. So, yeah, I would say Nintendo contributed in that regard, thanks to Star Fox.
Well, now we're at that point in the timeline then. So Sweet Home's come out. It's done its thing. Obviously, we know Sweet Home was a licensed movie tie-in. The origins of Resident Evil. You had some great insight on the like Capcom in financial trouble and that sort of thing in the lead up to Resident Evil. Resident Evil wasn't even necessarily going to happen. Go into the detail of the origins of the original Resident Evil game. Why Sony? Was it going to be a first-person shooter? Was it always going to be a fixed camera?
Yeah, the original conception was first person. But it just didn't happen because they weren't familiar enough with the technology of the PlayStation to make that happen in 1995. So that's why they went with the fixed camera angles. Yeah, it was originally first person, then it became a third person fixed camera angle game, and then they settled on the tank controls in order to reinstill that sense of fear. They did try having real-time 3D controls like you would see in Devil May Cry or in Super Mario 64, and they thought that it wasn't scary enough. So that's all true, and I think that's all quite well known. So
now with that, like, because this is something I've been asked in conversations online. Because obviously the whole thing about first person, that's like Shinji put that out in an interview, close to 10 years ago now, I think, was the first time that one of those interviews came out where he spoke on that. And there was that, I was discussing that with somebody, and they're like, well, if that's true, like if they always wanted Resident Evil to be in first person, understandably the first title, limitations, whatever. But then they carried that theme all the way through until, literally recently, minus, a couple of little first-person experiments Capcom has done with the franchise then and there. Why do you think that, as they learned the hardware and the engines better and the better game technology got, why they decided to continue on with the pre-rendered backgrounds before, ultimately Code Veronica and Survivor getting actual 3D renders or more of a 3D controlled environment? Was it just they got used to it and it did well the first time, so they kept just, like, hey, if it's not broke, we're not going to fix it, just keep rolling?
Absolutely, yeah. If you look at Capcom, they'll take an idea and they'll do it several times before they decide to make any serious changes to it. Evidenced by the fact that we're at 11 Mega Man games now, right? And how many Street Fighter games are there? So, yeah, I would say the formula proved to work, and it would have been a very big and calculated risk to try to change that from the second entry onward. I think Capcom wanted to get the formula through and very well instilled through multiple installments before really breaking away from that. The plan was to break away from it with the third Resident Evil game, which at the time would have been the game that became Resident Evil 4, right? And
Right.
through all its different iterations. But just to contextualize, the first person idea, in my opinion, never really went away in the sense that we would think of it as consumers, because Resident Evil Survivor came out only just under 4 years after the original one. And that, back in the day, games had shorter development times, but it wasn't. By that point, some games could take a few years to develop, and Resident Evil Survivor was not made overnight. That took about a year to develop. So, Capcom was already revisiting the idea of a first-person Resident Evil, like less than 3 years after the release of the original, and they did find a way to make it happen. I do think we have House of the Dead to thank for that as well. I think House of the Dead coming out was kind of an indicator to Capcom that it could be possible to release a first-person Resident Evil. And there's also the first-person mode in Code Veronica, right?
Mhm.
Code Veronica began development in 1998, barely 2 years after the original game, and they knew they wanted that to be a fully polygonal 3D Resident Evil experience. And the first-person element, was something that I believe was already planned, relatively early on in the development of that game. So yeah, and then you think about that first person knifing mode in Deadly Silence, and I think the Resident Evil 1 being a first person experience, it's funny, for us it seems like a very distant idea, but I do think that it's something that Capcom has actually revisited a lot more often than we could see from our vantage point. And obviously that culminates in Umbrella Chronicles being like the most fleshed out first-person Resident Evil 1 experience we have so far anyway. So it'll be interesting if they actually did go back and remake RE1 with the Resident Evil 7 style gameplay. I think that would be very interesting, personally.
It's really interesting you say that, because it's a comment that obviously here at Biohazard Declassified we always see, and it's Resident Evil 7 and 8 aren't Resident Evil games because they're in first person. And actually, when you look back at the history of Resident Evil, it's peppered with first person shooters. And the original was conceptualized as a first person shooter. I always found that kind of funny.
And
yeah.
And I always make the joke, though, that Resident Evil 1 is technically in first person because you can shoot the cameras. So
yeah, it's a voyeuristic kind of experience. Yeah, it's
did you actually get a chance to talk with anybody about the inclusion of that in Resident Evil 1 and 2 by chance? Because I know that's like a little, I know that's like such a minor thing, but it's always been weird to me that was included.
I didn't talk about Easter eggs all that much. I think the only one I really talked about it, I'm not even sure if I included this in the book, was about DIJ. That was the mouse, right? That was the one Easter egg that I spent, not a lot of time, but a few minutes talking about. I didn't talk about shooting the camera or anything super detailed like that, unfortunately. I probably should, it. But when I was writing this book, I wasn't trying to write a Wikipedia.
Sure.
I was trying to write, something more narrative based, and I think something like the camera angles being shot at would have been a little too much out of context for the book, unfortunately.
That's fair.
Yeah. But, they could be ideas for the future, things to talk about on a podcast or whatnot.
Yeah. Well, and then, you always have to have a sequel book because you only covered the first 10 years.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to give it time until I write the follow-up volume, because a lot of the people who worked on everything after the first 10 years are still at Capcom. And,
right.
They have to be very careful about what their staff say on the record. It gets a lot easier when you've left the company, interestingly enough.
Sure.
Like, even though I guess technically things like NDAs are still in place even after you leave the company, but in the greater interest of game history, I find that people have been very cooperative about talking about things like this. So hopefully someday. I mean, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but maybe. You never know.
So there was this. It's kind of like a myth, kind of a. Is it fake or is it a real thing? And it's something, again, I forgot to catch up with you on. Between Resident Evil 1 and 2, there was supposedly a game in development called Biohazard Dash. And you was meant to be you're not filling me with confidence. No, but
I'm
you was
trying
meant
to recall,
yeah, you was meant to be revisiting the mansion post-explosion. Everything was meant to be overgrown and kind of like, do you know how if you ever played Dino Crisis 2 when you went to Edward City and everything's kind of overgrown, nature's kind of taken over. Did any of the developers between you talking about Resident Evil 1 and 2, any of the developers mention this mysterious game?
I think Biohazard Dash, the name itself, might have been a mistranslation, because there was a Street Fighter Zero Dash or Street Fighter Dash 2. I think Street Fighter 2 used the Dash name in Japan. I think in the US it ended up being Hyper Fighting or whatever. Oh God, it's a handful. I don't believe that a Resident Evil game that took place in the rubble of the mansion was ever actually developed, but I do know that was an idea that somebody had somewhere at Capcom. But it just never really became a thing, like an actual game prototype or whatnot.
Okay, so I mean, it was more. If it were going to be anything, it was just going to be a mere concept.
Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't Street Fighter. Well, there was a Street Fighter 2 Dash, but I think around the same time, Rockman Dash, which was Mega Man Legends, was in development, and that might have been where the whole Biohazard Dash name initially came from, like someone misinterpreting some piece of information or mistranslating it. So yeah, it was Rockman Dash, Mega Man Dash, not Resident Evil Dash or Biohazard Dash.
So, but speaking of conceptual titles, obviously after we had Resident Evil 1.5, the initial version of the final Resident Evil 2 we got. But in between Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica, or I shouldn't even say just Code Veronica, between 3, there was several iterations or concepts that went around for Resident Evil 3 as well. I know one of them, which I think was the same team that ended up creating the Resident Evil 3 that we actually got, I think was set on a cruise ship very similar to Resident Evil Gaiden, if I'm not mistaken. And then there was the Hunk concept game.
Yeah, that was definitely a thing, I would say, conceptually. There, to put a bit of a mundane spin on this, there are 30, 40, 50, 100 people on the game development team, even at that time. And it's not that one person comes up with the idea and they just go with it. usually what happens in Japanese game development, and I assume this is true everywhere, is that they ask everybody to come up with ideas, right? Submit those ideas, and then we throw brainstorming meetings about them for the next few weeks, if not months. And then we kind of, settle on an idea. We do a feasibility study, and then we go with the best idea. And even that idea is bound to change, as time goes on. And I do think that that's what happened here. I think among the dozens of ideas that I imagine were submitted by every member at Capcom, the boat idea with Hunk was just one of them. And maybe that was the one that might have been, moved on to the next stage, but wasn't really approved in the end, right? So I think that's the mundane way to put it, right? I think if we were to talk about every little Resident Evil idea that was conceptualized, we'd probably have hundreds of them, right? And so,
sure,
right. I know that doesn't sound exciting to people, I'm sure, but in my opinion, I haven't heard enough about the boat idea for it to be personally interesting to me. So I would say it's similar to the first person thing. Maybe, it was something that somebody wanted to do, but they couldn't do at the time. And so, I guess it's not helped by the fact that games like Dead Aim and Gaiden came out, right? So maybe
obviously the idea got used somewhere eventually,
right?
Which
right.
I don't think a lot of people, obviously it's really cool to see some of these things that were never meant to come to life, but they definitely lived on everywhere. Like obviously,
Right.
Resident Evil 2 in some aspects lived on in Resident Evil. The actual 1.5 lived on in 2. 3.5 ended up becoming Devil May Cry. Obviously the boat idea for 3 probably became either Gaiden or Dead Aim. There's a lot of
sometimes
Revelations or 5.
Exactly. I
Exactly.
forget how many
Exactly.
Resident Evils take place on a ship.
Exactly. And I mean, I think Revelations might be a bridge too far as this timeline is concerned.
Sure.
But I would say Dead Aim definitely had it. Probably had origins in the boat idea, given what we know about that game and who made that game as well. So,
and speaking of inspiring, if you look back at Resident Evil 1.5, you actually see a few instances where it's referenced in Resident Evil 2 remake. I feel
intentional, like the shooting range and
shooting range was a big one, yeah.
Well, even with that, like I would say some of the ideas from 1.5 that didn't make it into the final 2 definitely lived on in some aspects elsewhere. Well, I would say I can't remember the actual enemies in 1.5 what they were actually called, but I would say the eliminators from 0 definitely draw back to the gorilla from 1.5. Like I don't know if that intentionally correlated, but
absolutely. And this goes beyond just Resident Evil. Like you mentioned Devil May Cry earlier. A lot of ideas ended up in Onimusha, some in Dino Crisis, some in Haunting Ground, I would say. So it goes beyond just one game franchise. Capcom as a company is going to try to be as resourceful as possible when it comes to juggling the development of multiple games. So it's really fascinating to see how things eventually unfold.
Now that we're on the topic of Resident Evil 1.5, I know you had some choice words on our previous podcast. To paraphrase, the original developers thought it was shit. What did how do I want to phrase this? What do you think of the recent developments with Resident Evil 1.5? I mean, this is kind of outside of the scope of your book, I appreciate, but if you'd allow me, they've been, if you're not familiar, they've been reverse engineering an early build of Resident Evil 1.5, and I've been following it for probably at least 9 or 10 years now. What do you feel when you see kind of fans rebuilding effectively a half-finished game at this point? And what about the truth behind a potential 80% build being out there in the wild?
I think it's great. I think it's great that the community is vested in this project, and just because the actual creators don't like the game, it doesn't mean that it has no right to exist, or that someone shouldn't try to, tell the world what it would have been like. I mean, I haven't actually played Resident Evil 1.5 a lot yet, because to be honest, I don't like the game either. Like I've popped it in the emulator, I've tried playing it, and there's something about it that just doesn't feel right to me. But maybe they'll complete the game and they can fix that to some extent. But every time I pop in the demo, it just makes me realize that, yeah, they were probably right to not release Resident Evil 2 in this form. But I support the community when, in their endeavors to bring it back. I think it's been long enough that it doesn't hurt anybody for that to happen. And I think, it's a good discussion for sure.
Actually, in that vein, speaking of community projects, do you have any thoughts on like community projects such as During the Storm, for example, where they take the existing games and they've manipulated them to tell these very unique stories? I mean, they've been going on since, almost since Resident Evil came out, it seems.
I recently saw the one where you play as Ada in the Resident Evil 1 lab. Which I think was a very fascinating idea. And obviously, it's a fan build, so
we're almost at a point, Alex. Mm-hmm. We're almost at a point, I feel, that we're not just throwing. We're going beyond the realms of modding, really. We're not just throwing 10 Mr. X's in a room and going, "No, look at what mod I've created." We're almost I feel like with the Resident Evil modding community, obviously we've been involved with During the Storm, regularly talk with the creator of Ada's mod, Marvin's mod, Barry's mod, etc., etc. We're almost at a point where these mods are canonical. They're trying to make them canonically compatible. You're literally having fans creating their own Resident Evil games. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that's what makes video games. That's what makes video games such an interesting and distinguished media from other things. Maybe books might be the one that allow you a degree of integratability with the official canon, I guess. But like with the video games, you can see that, and you can even play it depending on how far you are. And I think it's great. I mean, it's technically you can't say something like that is canon or official, but it's interesting stuff to see what creative people are capable of, and I absolutely support that. And it'd be nice if Capcom were more like Sega in that regard, where I feel like Sega does offer a lot of good recognition for fan projects, which is why we have Sonic Mania today. Interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say that was completely built by fans,
right?
Correct?
Yeah, I mean there's a little bit more behind that as to why it was able to be approved, but like it'd be nice if the publishers were into that sort of thing and can find a way to make it official or be more supportive of it. But obviously, I guess like I live in Japan, and I don't know if anyone knew this, but Japan recently passed. I don't know if it was recently or if they just started enforcing it recently. But technically, modding a game is illegal, right? Yeah. It's not legal to mod a game or like mod game hardware here in Japan. And we recently had a case where somebody was arrested, despite there being a pandemic going on, someone was arrested for selling modded Pokemon to be traded into people's games. And to me personally, that just sounds ridiculous, right? Like to use the law enforcement system to stop something like that. Right. So that just goes to show how tricky of a situation it could be for Capcom.
Yeah,
as a Japanese company. So.
Yeah. And unfortunately though, that I hate to say it, but having somebody arrested for modded Pokemon sounds like a very Nintendo thing to do.
It does.
Unfortunately, like I love Nintendo. Like I'll always have a special place in my heart from Nintendo because I feel like they're like the true last bastion of the video game industry, because they are still the only surviving hardware publisher, true video game company, whereas Microsoft and Sony just are outlets of their larger brands. But
Yeah.
they get a little ridiculous with their IP, and it's just
They can be, yeah. They've got the, it's a joke, but they've got the ninjas waiting to drop down from the ceiling. Capcom's not quite like that, thankfully.
which I do appreciate, and I understand being able to protect your intellectual property. At the same time, though, like I will say, like, and I don't know if like Capcom does this intentionally or it's just oversight on their part, but I do appreciate the fact that Capcom at least appears gracious with its community. Like you don't see them, I mean, obviously one of the bigger, C&Ds that they issued was for Invader Studios when they were doing the Resident Evil 2 remake. And I think at one time, 1.5 got a C&D because somebody was trying to sell copies of it, but that was cleared up and they were able to, obviously continue work. But
yeah, I would say
that Capcom's been very gracious with the community. Like you don't see them shutting down fan projects very often or doing any of this. And like I said, I understand as a company you want to profit off of your property. Like you spend millions or whatever research, development, building it. But if somebody comes out and is like, "Hey, I love your product so much, I'm going to build an audience of people that I'm going to try to get to love your product too." I feel like that's more beneficial. And this is something I don't understand about Nintendo that I feel like a lot of other communities appreciate. It's like, yes, like they might be doing this, but how many people are they exposing to your brand that might not have ever seen your brand otherwise? And to me, like the trade-off, like you have companies like Bethesda, for all of Bethesda's faults, they will let people do crazy shit with Skyrim or any of their other properties because they know some YouTuber is going to upload, I'm turned Bernie Sanders into a dragon on Skyrim, and that's going to make people fire up Skyrim for the first time in years, or people to buy Skyrim for the first time because they're like, holy shit, I can put like these crazy mods in the game. So I wish, like I said, I am grateful for the fact that Capcom seems to be on that same side where they understand that these community projects end up bringing more attention to the actual products.
I agree. Personally speaking, I can't speak from a professional standpoint, so I don't want there to be any misunderstandings, but I do think that a high level of fan integration into a company's marketing push does way more help than it does any harm to anybody. And I do think that, Capcom, you said they were being very gracious, which I think could be a good word to describe them for sure. At minimum, I think they've been fair about a lot of things. I don't think they're fundamentally unfair about how they approach relationships like these. So, I think Capcom, I think it's a blessing that, we were able to have these fan projects. I'm able to write this book, without being C&D'd. And I think it's great.
Yeah, well, I didn't even think about this, but I mean, recently with the Resident Evil showcase, Capcom sent out a big thing, hey, if you've got a community of people, you can be a co-streamer of the Resident Evil Village project. So I'm glad to see that we've reached a point because obviously social media is not really a new thing, but the rules of social media and how it's used in marketing is still fairly new and is ever evolving. And I was actually really glad to see Capcom realize that hey, we might be able to get 20, 30,000 people to tune into a live event on our channel, but if we reach out to these creators and pat them on the back a little bit and make them feel special to want their communities to be involved, we just turned our 20, 30,000 people into 200,000 people. And I like I said, I've been very appreciative of Capcom's working with the community in those regards. Obviously no company or I think is perfect, and I wish there's things that Capcom would try to work on a little bit better, but
sure,
I think they've done a really, really good job in the grand scheme of things. Even with their new updates on policy, I think were very fair and probably much needed.
Yeah, I guess it just comes down to perspective in the end, and what you really want out of the company. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I do think Nintendo fans have it much worse.
Oh, absolutely.
At the same time, though, it also depends on what exactly you're into at Capcom. I think if you're a Monster Hunter fan, you're blessed. If you're a Street Fighter fan, you're blessed. Mega Man, it wasn't great for a long time, but now I feel like it's amazing for them. Resident Evil, sure. Devil May Cry, yes. It sucks to be a Dino Crisis fan, I would say. Actually,
yeah. No,
I think.
But
asterisk Dino Crisis sucks. SUX.
Have you seen anything from Team Arclay's Dino Crisis project?
I have not actually. That's probably a question that's better for Jaw Muncher.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure. But yeah, I feel.
Well, no, I'm just saying, like, they seem to have it really good because they're creating this complete, remake of Dino Crisis in Unreal 4, and nobody officially is paying them any mind whatsoever. And it looks like from the last development screenshots, they are a lot further along as not even like an actual indie developer, just Dino Crisis fans, than Invader got as an indie studio with their Resident Evil 2 remake before they were shut down. So I don't know if they haven't stirred the right thing, stirred the wrong pot yet, or Capcom is just definitely never coming back to Dino Crisis and just doesn't care.
Yeah, I mean, it is really fascinating how Dino Crisis has been, at this point, let's just say it, they're ignoring it for I don't know why, to be honest. I say Dino Crisis sucks to Jaw probably 5 times a day, but deep down I do kind of feel bad for him. Only kind of. Well, I mean, we had dinner with the director of Dino Crisis 2 a few years ago. I actually, when Jaw Muncher came to Tokyo, we took a train to Osaka, and I was able to introduce him to the director, Shu Takubi-san, but he's more well known for Ace Attorney nowadays. So, he made a comment when we were chatting that it had been a long time since someone really spoke to him about Dino Crisis, and he himself was kind of wondering if people had forgotten about it. So he was really happy that there are still fans out there.
And it's like, oh no, we haven't forgot. We're still waiting on Dino Crisis 4.
It's like,
or an apology for 3, one of the two.
We're here, all 4 of us. Or yeah.
So, obviously,
which is funny because.
No, I was just going to say, you don't bring us a lot of confidence with what you say. Obviously, you're in the circle, the game circles now. You don't bring us a lot of confidence that Dino Crisis is even being spoken about, which is interesting considering the inevitable cross. I mean, every time I've streamed Dino Crisis, I've had similar viewership to Resident Evil.
This camera will not show, but it says Dino Crisis sucks. I want you to believe me.
No, I see you and Jaw Muncher's interactions a bit. But no.
But from just to round that point off, from your perspective, Alex, you've not heard any murmurs of anything to do with Dino Crisis in the Capcom circles.
I mean, I've talked to people at Capcom who would personally like to make a new one, but that's very different than it being actually a thing. So,
well, the last people who said something about making Dino Crisis remake was Capcom Vancouver, and Capcom shut them down. So apparently, I think there's a correlation there.
I mean, I did talk with one of the directors at Capcom over drinks a few years ago, and that person offhand just mentioned, yeah, I would personally like to make a Dino Crisis, but I have other projects to work on. I think that's the extent of anything that I've heard from the high level in the past 2 or 3 years. So yeah, it's too bad. Personally, I think a dinosaur action game from Capcom has the potential to probably be bigger than Devil May Cry, in my opinion.
Oh, well, I mean, you're seeing like a ton of other studios tackle this idea of dino horror. You've got Instinction, Compound Fracture, Death Ground. I mean, there's definitely a lot of people ready to take up the Dino Crisis mantle if Capcom won't.
Right.
Which is funny because Shinji like moved away from Resident Evil for I obviously not speaking for him, but from what I understand from interviews was Resident Evil was getting stale from him, so he moved on to create not Resident Evil but Resident Evil. Which is
Right.
it's just funny to me that he doesn't seem to stick around projects very long. But why, he went back to Resident Evil with Resident Evil 4, but didn't, try to
choice.
well, that's fair. But it would have been interesting to see him to return to Dino Crisis in a similar vein after maybe, the poor reception of Dino Crisis 3.
Well, even Dino Crisis 1, he wasn't the original director. It was actually Shu Takumi, who was, I think they're credited as co-directors right now, but
Right.
I think that was Takumi-san's first project, and so it didn't go well enough. So Mikami did have to save Dino Crisis apparently and finish the project off. So I would say, yeah. And I know Mikami was officially the director of Dino Crisis, but I think even when Mikami talked to me about it, he had to put an asterisk point behind that part. Saying that it wasn't 100% him the way Resident Evil 1 was, right? Or, what's the other one? God Hand, PM3,
Yes.
Vanquish, right?
Right.
Dino Crisis was more of a collaborative thing that he had to take over. Resident Evil 4 was that as well. And like I just mentioned, he was on Resident Evil 4 literally because there was nobody else who could save the project, right? So that's why he ended up being on there.
Are you happy with how Resident Evil 4 come out?
Oh yeah, that's my favorite Resident Evil game. People have complaints about it not being horror oriented enough. Fair enough. But it was a matter of life and death for the series at that point, and I think Mikami absolutely made the right decision to change things up to save the franchise. Because at the time, I feel like the company was losing its interest in Resident Evil and was more interested in propping up franchises like Monster Hunter, Devil May Cry, Onimusha, Dead Rising, eventually as well. If you look at who the leadership was at Capcom at the time, and I think if Mikami hadn't done what he did, it could have very much ended up like Dino Crisis, maybe, where they just stopped making them to focus on other stuff. So,
because that was, technically Mikami's third revamp of the horror franchise. He coined survival horror with Resident Evil, then panic horror with Dino Crisis, I think was what he called it, and then action horror with Resident Evil 4.
Yep. And that wasn't his grand plan from the beginning. That's just kind of how things turned out, right? He was at that place at that time, and this is what he had to make, right? And by his own admission, he called Resident Evil 4 a full model change as early as the year 2000, I think. And by his own admission, he actually had no idea what that meant. So it was always intended to be a very vague statement. The point being that, Resident Evil 4 was going to be different. So the whole full model change thing was kind of a marketing word to get people excited for how different it would be. The point being that it wasn't going to be another fixed camera Resident Evil game. So, he didn't have this grand ambition to revamp horror 3 times. I feel like that's more of a coincidence.
Yeah, no, he just happened to be in the right place at the right time, I feel. But not just he didn't just redefine the horror genre with Resident Evil 4. He kind of revamped the entire gaming industry. Had Resident Evil 4 been more like the initial titles, or even more like Code Veronica, I feel the gaming industry probably would be slightly different, than we've seen it today. Like I think the transitions there, made in 4 and after 4 were probably inevitable. But I think 4 definitely pushed other developers, other studios to either follow suit, or their games just weren't going to survive.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, this is a job for these people, and there's a bottom line, and the money, unless you're Microsoft, the money pits aren't bottomless, right? So, in my opinion, Mikami saved Resident Evil. So as far as I'm concerned, he can do whatever the hell he wants, right? At this point. So, I've never been, fond of the people who complained about Resident Evil 4. Not that they're like a majority, but I feel like that's popping up more and more now, where they're like, oh, Resident Evil 4 ruined the franchise. And I'm like, this franchise exists today because of that game. So sometimes you have to take a loss in order to gain stuff later down the line. And I don't consider Resident Evil as taking an L. I would consider more like Resident Evil 6 to be that game where they took the L, and it allowed them to figure out what they really needed to do. So
my problem is, and I've talked with this with other people in the community, is I don't understand the argument of, well, this isn't a Resident Evil game because X, Y, whatever. And that you hear that argument a lot with 4 and 7, which I would, obviously outside of the first and maybe the first 3 games, maybe I think 4 and 7 kind of are huge milestones for Capcom, because 7 brought back, as much as some fans might dislike the game, it definitely put Resident Evil back on the map. It brought more people into the genre. It brought horror back, especially people who were expecting game like Silent Hill to come out or whatever. And then 4, obviously turning the entire gaming industry on its heels. But my biggest problem with this, this isn't a Resident Evil game because of how it plays. And going back and playing through the series, like, I don't understand that argument, because Capcom only keeps a certain play style for maybe 3 games at a time. It's like, well, obviously, we can appreciate 1, 2, and 3 for what they are, but out of, you look at those 3 games, and maybe, obviously we'll include 1 and 0, 1 remake and 0 in there. So you got 5 games out of a 23 game franchise.
Well, 6 if you include Code Veronica. How dare you forget Code Veronica?
I think including mobile games, there's either 23 or I think 25 titles. I forget, but
there are like, yeah. Sorry,
but to me, just to judge the entire franchise because 1, 2, and 3 played a certain way, when Capcom has never definitively stuck to one theme. Like 1, 2, and 3 play different than 4, 5, and 6, and even in 4, 5, and 6 play differently from each other. And then 7 being different more, and then you've got Code Veronica, which is still a mainline title that plays different than all of them. So,
we're about to celebrate the 25th anniversary of Resident Evil, so there is, that's a quarter of an entire century. There is bound to be a high level of variance, from one era to another. And that's definitely true of Resident Evil. So I do agree with you that it's just unrealistic to bind the Resident Evil franchise to one particular style. It's always been, like you compare it to Street Fighter and Mega Man. Mega Man, you control Mega Man in almost every game, right? Or a variation of Mega Man. Or, Street Fighter has largely been about Ryu and Ken and Guile, right? The same cast from Street Fighter and Street Fighter 2. You look at Resident Evil, and there's so much more to offer, right? Like, the fact that, I can have a wall mural in my living room with 8 different amazing characters, right? And, they've been portrayed by different people over the years in their own way, and they've all done an amazing job. Like, I think, now is the time to celebrate the diversity of Resident Evil rather than, try to get yourself wrapped up in any particular singular element. So, I'm personally a supporter of Capcom's diversification efforts. can they at this point go back and make a fixed camera Resident Evil game? Absolutely. I think they should do that as well. I think Capcom does take a lot of risks with Resident Evil, and I would like to see them do more because I know they can do more. But I also absolutely recognize everything that they've done so far, and I hope that they can continue to improve on it.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I stand too. You know, obviously I don't care as much for every Resident Evil title. You know, there are definitely titles and play styles or, you know, whatever that I enjoy more. But I think that was my submission to your little project that you've got coming out soon as well, was I love the diversity of Resident Evil. Like, I love the fact that Capcom has always taken risks with this franchise. Like, obviously sometimes not for the best, like Umbrella Corps.
Yeah.
You know, or 6. Like, for what it is, like, 6 is not a terrible game. Like, 6 is definitely not my favorite Resident Evil title. But there are, like, it's a weird mix of, like, there's all these great components there.
Master of none.
Can't.
Yeah, like, it's, yeah, exactly. Like, it's a jack of all trades, but a master of none. Like, it didn't tell the best narrative, but it had a great setup for a narrative, I think. I think the play style was an evolution on 4, 5, and 6 that was much needed for the time, but didn't feel as comfortable to play as 4 and 5 did. So I think 6, if it would have been shrank down to maybe like one campaign or done like Revelations where it was released episodically, I think 6 might have been a better point in the franchise than what it ended up being.
I mean, you can't. I mean, you know, we're at number 7. We're about to get number 8. But, you know, I think there are like 15 Resident Evil games, if you really think about it. If you include Code Veronica 0, Revelations 1, 2, The Outbreaks, easily between 15 and 20 at this point. And, you know, they're all made by different people at different times with different budgets. And inevitably, they're all going to vary in quality. And I just think that when a franchise has been going on for this long, you're just going to end up with games that are, you know, not as good as others. Other franchises have had this problem. You know,
like Mega Man's actually a really good example of that.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with Mega Man because I'm really terrible at those games. But yeah, I do have my friend Mohammed Taher is definitely very opinionated, and I know that he likes certain Mega Man games more than others. The other comparison I can think of is, you know, ask a Mario fan how they feel about Super Mario Sunshine, for example, right?
But, you know, which is actually one of my favorite Super Mario titles.
Well, I like it too, but I can see why a lot of people don't.
Yeah,
no, I think a lot of the takeaway for Super Mario Sunshine was like, hey, we should probably focus more on less the sandbox and more of the platforming itself. And we ended up with Mario Galaxy, which is one of the best games I've personally ever played. And I think Resident Evil is very similar to that. I think 6 was very divisive, and then it paved the way for both Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake to come out. And, you know, those 2 games are easily in my top 5 Resident Evil games of all time. Well, yeah, and I think if 6 hadn't come out, Capcom may not have made those the way they did.
Yeah, and that's what, like I said, I appreciate about the diversity of Resident Evil. You know, I think Mario is actually a great example because you look. Or actually, any title that's still around, in my opinion, from those early days, like Super Mario, Mega Man, I think they all fall in the same trap of where they were really good on their launch platforms. But then when you had the transition from 2D to 3D, they had these awkward stages of trying to figure out. I think Nintendo handled it a lot better with Mario 64 than Capcom did with some of their 3D Mega Man titles. But
yeah, I need to get the point in that, like, resurrecting a game franchise is, you know, not easy.
No,
saving a game franchise is not easy. Ask Silent Hill fans how that's going, right? You know,
but like I said, the thing that I appreciate about Resident Evil's diversity is Mega Man has gone largely unchanged. Like, they've experimented here and there, and they were awful, so they went back to what's comfortable. And I would say Mario does this a lot too. Like, they'll experiment with new things, like the Origami King, I would say, is a very different Mario game than most.
Oh, I love that game. Yeah.
But when the new Super Mario games came out, like, they were great to see in 3D. They were great to see on, like, newer hardwares. But those were some of the most play it safe games that Nintendo could have possibly done. They're like, we know everybody loves Mario as a platformer. We know everybody loves, Super Mario World. So here's new Super Mario World. Basically the exact same game with better graphics. And I feel like Nintendo played it really safe, keeping Mario in the relevancy that he still has today, where Capcom's just kind of, marched in, like a drunk guy at a concert and was like, hey guys, we got this crazy thing going on right now. And sometimes it's panned out and sometimes it hasn't. But like I said, I can appreciate to keep the game, the game and the franchise moving forward instead of stagnating on either a play style or a set of characters. Capcom's taken risks. And even if those were just one-offs, never happened again, they still happened. And I think the franchise is much better for it.
I think we're lucky. There was a 4-year and 3-month gap between Resident Evil 6 and Resident Evil 7. And in between that time, we got, like a remaster of Revelations, a remaster of Remake, Zero, Umbrella Corps, which is, that was a pretty long 4 years for me. But if you look at the gap between Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, we see what we got in that time. We got 2 fantastic games, and Village looks amazing. RE3 I wasn't as fond of, but I do think that overall I still liked it. So, I think it's a good time for the franchise, and I hope that Capcom can keep their momentum going.
I think the most exciting thing for me since 7's release is seeing the evolution of the RE engine on almost a yearly basis. Look at the difference. Obviously there was a 2-year gap between RE7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake, but seeing the games jump in quality, like 7 to me is still a very gorgeous game, even to this day. Like I don't think that the RE engine has aged poorly at all, which is weird to say in a span of 4 years since its release, but 2 definitely improved everything from 7. And I feel that the larger controversy over Resident Evil 3 Remake outshadows the fact that graphically it makes Resident Evil 2 and 7 look last gen to me.
Actually, yeah, I was going to say RE3 was a huge leap, like in terms of visual design, even over 2.
Absolutely. And absolutely. Like I said, it makes 2 look last gen. If you truly compare them 2 side by side, with whatever max settings you're capable of, you can tell that they were built around the same time, but 3 looks like a remaster in terms of graphic fidelity.
Yeah, I would say that just came down to, I think the year and few months gap between the 2 made a big difference. I also think Devil May Cry 5's development, like a lot of what they learned, a lot of the techniques and the technologies that they extracted from DMC5 was also used in RE3, whereas it wouldn't have been as accessible in RE2, which I think was another reason why. But yeah, RE3, like I loved how that game looked, and especially the cutscenes. Like you see how Jill and Carlos's face, Nikolai's faces are all modeled, and it is absolutely impeccable in my opinion. And actually, to be honest, I don't even think Village's cutscenes look as good from what we've seen, which might be more of a design thing. But we'll have to see how the game looks, when it comes out.
That's the interesting thing to me about Resident Evil 7 is 7. Its cutscenes look like, obviously it doesn't have true cutscenes. It's more in game than it is anything. But it's weird to me because like the characters reach this weird uncanny valley where the faces don't look correct, but they do at the same time. And I think it fits with the style that 7 goes for. Like 7 is made to make you feel uneasy. So you see these people that are definitely super like hyper realistic modeling, but there's still something kind of off about them. But like I said, I think it works for that. Where Village, tend to get the same vibe from. Like, I don't know what area of production we're getting the current cutscenes and stuff from, but Lady Dimitrescu kind of strikes me the same way as Resident Evil 7's, in-game characters looked versus like 2 and 3, where 2 and 3, I think, went for more of a hyper realism, where 7 wanted you to realize that this is basically seeing the real person's face, but make it awkward enough to where it makes you uneasy.
And I think
that's where we're at right now.
I just think a lot of it does come down to the progression of time. Like, look, the gap between Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village is only a little bit longer than the gap between Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil Code Veronica. So, you can do a lot in 4 years, given how fast technology progresses. I mean, I think as adults, Resident Evil 7 still feels very recent to us in a lot of ways, because, time passes by a lot more quickly for us than it did when we were younger. So I imagine if you were around when Resident Evil 1 was out and maybe you were very young, the gap between Code Veronica and 1 might feel like a very long one, versus 7 to Village. But yeah, I would say a lot of it really does probably just come down to technology, honing in on their craft. Resident Evil 7 was the first RE Engine game and the first photogrammetry game. So it was very much a learning process for Capcom. And I still think Resident Evil 7 looks great today. I wouldn't mind if they went back and remastered it to have better textures or whatnot, or to remodel the faces. But I mean, I don't think it's a deal breaker at this point, personally.
What do you think of how Resident Evil 8 is the way Resident Evil 8 is taking its story now? Obviously, we've only seen a little amount. The game's coming out in a couple of months, but of what you've seen with this quote unquote bad Chris, what are your initial thoughts about where they're taking it?
I mean, I have I think Capcom is good at setting up like dramatic plot twists. And I emphasize, I think they're good at setting it up. Whether it's, Jill's thing in Resident Evil 5, or the Ada thing in Resident Evil 6, or the whole thing about Resident Evil 7's supernatural hallucinations. Personally speaking, sometimes the payoff isn't as great as the actual setup. Like we all found out, spoilers, Jill's actually alive and she's being manipulated, or the whole Ada clone thing, right? And honestly, like, my expectations are grounded when it comes to the whole bad Chris thing. Like, there ought to be something that's causing him to be a little oblique in how he behaves, and I'm pretty sure we'll find out why. And there will have been some reason that he did that, and all will be forgiven. I don't know, maybe.
It also marks the third time where we've had a perceived Chris quote unquote heel turn. We had the original in the Resident Evil Revelations E3 trailer that never come to fruition. Sorry, that's an ongoing joke here at the Biohazard Declassified Podcast. And a little known one that's only just come to my head is the way they portrayed Chris in the original Resident Evil 6 trailer, where it was Leon and Chris in that iconic scene where they pointed guns at each other, and you thought, oh, hang on a minute, Chris is bad. What's going on here?
Well, I would even count Resident Evil 7's I'm Redfield, little bizarro plot twist that went nowhere.
Which they're also keeping on for RE-verse, the same model, which is so bizarre because we've now got two.
I really don't get that. I really have no idea how anybody can seriously rationalize that, but it is what it is. And yeah. Which, I mean, that just supports my point. Like, the payoff is rarely ever matched to the build-up or the setup, right? And I think maybe I love Capcom, but it would be nice if they figured out how to actually, give proper payoffs to their big plot twists, right?
Yeah, because I would say like the only one that I think was actually worth it was maybe Resident Evil 1. Finding out Wesker was the bad guy at the end. And to me, like, it's not really that much of a huge twist because there's only a handful of characters in the game, and I feel like the lead up was always there was going to be a bad person. So even I now that I actually think about it out loud, I don't actually think Resident Evil 1 was worth the payoff either.
Yeah, I can't comment because I played Code Veronica first. So obviously when you go backwards, there is no payoff, right? Although I would say I did play the original version of Code Veronica, and I do. Actually, I would say Code Veronica is a good example of a build up that might have paid off because the whole Wesker thing was, even though it took place across multiple games, I do think the Wesker plot was pretty well done for the most part.
Yeah, except for I don't know, the whole 5 to me was like a lot of build-ups that never came to fruition. Like, like 5 is like you can tell Chris is on a mission, and then you finally figure out that his mission, kind of involves Jill finding out that she's alive. And then like you get to the point where there's the big Jill reveal that she's the girl in the cloak the whole time, and then you have the big, Jill Wesker boss fight. They save Jill, and you're like, oh my god, Jill and Chris are about to like take down Wesker together because you did it separately in the very first game, and this is like the end of this whole arc. And then Jill's like, oh, I'm gonna stay behind, you go with Sheva. And I was always like, oh,
she does pass him the rocket launcher though, so she was present.
She does, but like how I like Sheva as a character. I think that Capcom could have done a little bit more with her backstory. But the weird thing to me about 5 is you've got, like as you progress through the game, you meet Josh Stone, and it's very heavily thrown into the game that Josh and Sheva have some kind of, professional friendship relationship. Like she's the little sister of Delta Team. Like you can tell that there's a dynamic there. And then you get to the late half, like the last act of the game, and Josh is still alive and he's looking for a way out. And then you get Chris and Jill together, and you're like, they even did the mode with Josh and Jill later on. And it's like, so you get like 4 people together, and then 2 of them have a pre-existing relationship with their equal counterpart. I still don't understand why Jill didn't go with Chris, like when she basically did the exact same thing by going with Josh. Like it just kind of killed. Like the payoff to me was, or like I never got the satisfaction of having Jill and Chris take down Wesker together. I feel like it should have been.
The only thing that kind of makes sense is that when you've got that stealth bomber where Sheva lets go of.
He has a flashback.
And he has a flashback, I don't want to lose another teammate, which is brutal irony because he ends up in Resident Evil 6, just his team getting absolutely just murdered in front of him, as he often does, Mr. Chris. But yeah, I do think that's a really good point. Actually, I've never explored that. That actually canonically makes total sense for them to swap characters at that point.
Yeah, obviously, I think the Jill.
Alex, what do you think? What do you think?
Either way, I mean, I love Desperate Escape, so it's not like they did nothing with Jill eventually. I think it makes sense that she was feeling exhausted and that she couldn't go on the mission because, like if you've been brainwashed for 3 years and then 2 minutes later you have to go fight somebody, right? I think it would have been a little harder to implement than most people can imagine. Yeah, I mean, I would love to see more Sheva. I think Sheva needs to come back. I think she would be an amazing character, and given the times that we live in, I think it's absolutely necessary for Capcom to continue to diversify the faces of Resident Evil. I mean, I would like to have a black photogrammetry Resident Evil character on this wall someday, right? And I hope it's coming. And I'm an Asian male as well, and I can't really think of an Asian male Resident Evil character off the top of my head. So I would love to see someone similar to myself represented in the future Resident Evil game as well.
I'm at a
so
loss.
yeah,
Yeah, I was trying
I think there was an Asian.
like,
Wasn't there an Asian character in the team that got ambushed by Ouroboros?
probably.
yes. Oh
But-
yeah, I know exactly.
That's the only. I'm sorry, Alex. That's all I've got.
Yeah, I mean, well, I like that Ada was around from very early on.
Yeah, Ada.
So I think
Yeah.
she's a very interesting character too. But yeah, I mean, Resident Evil, from the beginning, I would say had a lot of diversity. But as time progresses, the standards do go up, and I hope that Capcom can continue to follow that.
My only thing is, I don't know if I would want to see Sheva in more of another video game, or I would like to see her in more CGI work.
Why not both?
Well, no, I'm not saying like both isn't the thing, but I know a lot of people want Rebecca, for example, to come back into the series, but Rebecca has, like she was in Vendetta, which, I mean, obviously not the best CGI film to have been in. But I feel like there's some things that you can flesh out in a cinematic narrative easier, or get a lot more across from a cinematic perspective than you can for a gameplay perspective. And that's one thing I think I would like to see more, would be Sheva have a more expanded story in a medium that could actually expand her story further. Chris is a very fleshed out character now because he's been in a ton of video games. Plus he was in, a CGI project, where like some other characters don't get that same kind of love. Like, Rebecca gets a more fleshed out story because she was in a couple of games plus a movie, whereas, like I said, I think if you just have a character in a game, it's really hard to flesh out their narrative, in a single game, or two games for that matter.
Yeah, I feel, Sheva could be a good character for a movie. Absolutely. I would say, this makes me very happy that Claire is coming back as well in Infinite Darkness, because I feel like she has the most to gain from an off-game portrayal, right? So I now that you mentioned that, Claire is probably the one character that I want to see more of in Infinite Darkness. And now that we know when it's taking place, it'll be an interesting way to bridge the gap between Degeneration and Revelations 2.
Yeah, because that's the interesting thing, is because we can kind of piece together, like, we know nothing really of like Chris and Claire's childhoods, but we know that she comes to Raccoon City in 1998, and then we know like she goes on to look for Chris in Europe during the events of Code Veronica, but really between that and her reintroduction in Degeneration would have been the first time she was back on the medium again. We know she went to work for TerraSave, but outside of, I think, some of the comic books and stuff, there's like no story there.
Yeah.
We just know like she, went from being a badass in Europe, seeing Chris for the last time apparently ever, to going to work for TerraSave. And then, like they continue that on, she disappears for a couple of games and then she comes back a couple more games come out, and then she comes back in Revelations 2, still with TerraSave. But there's that whole gap between CV and Degeneration that we have like no Claire story for. So I do like the fact that Infinite Darkness is taking place after 4, which I think would still even predate her TerraSave days.
Well, it would be right after she started. TerraSave.
Right out. Yeah, so, like the very beginning, or maybe a little bit before.
So that just reminded me of Claire in particular. I'd love to see Claire in another numbered Resident Evil game too. She's only been in one, right? Which is really interesting to think about. Even though I think of her as one of the Resident Evil 5, right? It would be Leon, Chris, Jill, Claire, and Ada. Right, so it's really surprising she's only been in one numbered Resident Evil game. Well, I mean, Code Veronica is as good as a numbered game. Absolutely,
the main line,
yeah. So,
Yeah, that's
Just on
interesting.
the
Like, I've
point-
never actually really thought about that. That she only gets like technically like one number title, and then technically only 2 mainline titles.
Right. So, yeah, I can't wait to see Infinite Darkness now that we've had this sidebar conversation.
But I will say though, if Claire's back, like they have to have Chris. I don't care if it's Resident Evil 8 Chris in there. I don't care if it's Resident Evil 7 Chris in there. I want to see Chris and Claire freaking like react to each other's existence for the first time in 20 years.
Me too, yeah. And I really liked their dynamic in Dark Side Chronicles a lot. We got to see a lot of them interacting with each other, but obviously that was a retelling. So yeah, it's really funny how they haven't gone back to that particular relationship. We've seen Leon and Claire a number of times. We've seen Chris and Jill a number of times, Leon and Ada, but yeah,
or even like the weird mix-ups, like 6 brought Leon and Chris together, which
no one asked for.
yeah, it's like, I mean, it's cool. Like I've thought about this before, but not really particularly something I wanted to see.
Leon and Sherry, which to me wouldn't make sense. To me, it's Claire and Sherry would make sense because they've got that kind of bond that they had through RE2. That made more sense. So it's like,
which is the interesting thing, because like
remake made that worse, right?
Yeah,
or less believable, if anything.
Yeah. It's so funny to me the way like 2 plays out in the end, because like as Leon, like you're only really introduced to Sherry in like the last like 30 seconds of the game. It's like, oh hey, random little girl. Whereas Claire, like you play, 75% of the game or better knowing of Sherry's existence. But then at the end of the game, like Sherry or like Claire's like, hey Leon, remember that little girl that like you met like 5 minutes ago? Well, she's yours now. Deuces, I'm going to Europe. Like that's like literally what happened. And then the government comes around, picks Leon and Sherry up. So like it's interesting because like obviously Leon and Sherry, have some common interest for, being picked up by the government and basically being government playthings from there on out. So, I mean, the dynamic in 6 with them meeting up again makes sense, but it's like, this is still such a weird way to pay off where you familiarize one character with one, and then you're just like, oh yeah, that's basically the last time they saw each other. And then, like, the character that they spent no time with is where their actual like payoff is.
Yep. Sherry and Leon, I think, is a believable relationship to have, but you have to imagine a lot of that happened off screen. Right?
Oh, yeah.
And this was a plot that was conceptualized with a 1998 game. So, they didn't have time to really elaborate on, Leon and Sherry's relationship. But I believe it. It's just hilarious that the remake walked back from that just a little bit, right? I think they meant to elaborate on it, and that's why the ending of Remake 2 is so lighthearted. And I think the whole Leon and Claire part, like in the ending of RE2 Remake, was fine. I think, I think he took a liking to her very quickly, but what I thought was funny was, when Claire introduces Sherry to Leon in the remake, and Leon's like, okay. And I'm pretty sure that was just a direction of that particular line delivery, but it was.
I thought it was somebody. I think somebody made a meme of that where they like just like kind of paused the scene and like drug it out for a little bit, so it made it like like watching it. It was like, hey Leon, this is Sherry, and he's like. But on just like long pause and like, okay. And it's like, oh, wow, that made it that much awkward.
On the flip side, Claire and Sherry in Remake 2 were amazing together. God, they I don't know if they recorded it in the same room, but yeah.
There was a lot of believable chemistry there.
Also, they filled in a little bit of history with Claire and Chris's parents about them dying. Their parents are dead, so it's that kind of relatably. I just wanted to pick up on your point. I know you mentioned about diversity in and now it is obviously goes without saying the more important than it's ever been, and I really believe they've got a perfect solution that they've had in the back pocket the entire time, and that is Resident Evil Outbreak, which is an absolute bastion of diversity. It's got black characters in it, it's got black males in it, black females in it, Asian characters. white characters. It's just an absolute rainbow of different colors. It's beautiful.
Yeah, there's a Native American character in there too, I think, right? I mean, they do tend to be a little stereotypical in their portrayals. Like not every police officer in America looks like Tom Cruise, right? But I appreciate that they tried.
Or what's his name? The Chris Tucker knockoff.
Jim.
Jim.
Yeah, Jim's character to me, it like is such a yeah. It's just like it's like, and I don't know, like, obviously I think there's a huge cultural difference between the West and the East. So I don't know if Capcom's familiar with a lot of like Western stereotypes of different people, but I feel like when they created Jim, like somebody literally sat down and watched Rush Hour with Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan and was like, okay, this is how these, like people like this act. And it's like, oh no, buddy, like you took like every stereotype imaginable from American television and rolled it into like two different characters. Cause I feel like that's very, like you said, it's very true that a lot of the characters in Outbreak are very stereotypical of their derivative like nationalities.
The alpha male white, cisgender, right? That would be Kevin, and Cindy the waitress, and Alyssa the dominatrix kind of womanly character. The passive Asian woman. Yeah, I mean those elements aren't too great in my opinion. They didn't really age well. I mean, they were funny to me when I played the game as a kid, but the world is a different place now. And I personally didn't have a problem with Resistance's portrayal of people. I thought that was a lot more reasonable. So I think Capcom probably recognizes that there's a way to do this without while being tasteful and respectful to people.
And I think that was kind of a failure. Like, I can appreciate now that we know that Reverse is coming out. So I kind of understand why product support for Resistance was cut so short. But I think Resistance was honestly a very, speaking of on diversity in video games, like, again, like it's not Outbreak. I don't think it was ever going to truly feel like Outbreak. But while they did have a fairly diverse cast at launch, like that, I think could have been expanded on dramatically had support for the game went on. And we still only got like a roster of 5 playable characters, the 4 initials plus Jill.
Yep.
Which, I mean, like I said, I mean, they kind of, like they had, African American representation, Asian representation, male, female representation. They had all this represented, but I think that would have been a game like that is the best medium where it's not just a faceless NPC. Like everybody can say, Call of Duty is diverse because you can pick your skin color or whatever in Call of Duty, but you're basically like just reskinning a blank slate. Whereas Resident Evil, like even, if you want to consider Resistance characters, throwaway characters, like they still have a backstory that fits within the lore. Like these are still fleshed out real characters. Like you're not giving somebody a generic NPC and calling it diversity. Like I would argue that the fact that you can play as any of them is like truly indicative of being diverse for the sake of a story versus, just like, oh, we put in, extra skins that make your character a certain skin color. Like you see with a lot of multiplayer titles.
There is definitely a very big difference, and I completely agree. I know the Smash communities had this discussion recently as well. So,
do you think?
Hopefully,
Do you think that this played a huge reason in why Sheva was included in Resident Evil 5? Was to kind of where it was set. They did have that bit. It wasn't a scandal, but it was something that was brought into the media about the quote unquote race, the purported racism of a white character going to Africa and shooting it up. Do you think that was a big reason why or did they have that in their mind the entire time? Do you think?
My understanding was that Sheva was going to be there from the start. Now I don't know for sure yet whether she had the same role from the beginning or it was expanded upon. I know she was there from the beginning though, and I do think their intention was always to have an African woman be Chris's partner character. I would say, I mean, because if you think about it, Resident Evil has largely paired a man and a woman together, right? And until Resident Evil 5, that precedent hadn't really been broken. I think Resident Evil 6 was the first one that did, right, with Chris's campaign, which was offset by Revelations 2, right? So, I believe the people at Capcom when they told me that, it wasn't really the intention to be insensitive, but I think from what I know, they recognize that there is sensitivity around that subject matter, and it is something to be, discussed and implemented carefully going forward. So, I mean, there's still work to do in a lot of ends, I think, but I mean, I'm hopeful that Capcom can continue to make progress.
And I feel like that's the only tricky thing about a lot of this is, obviously, I think like going back to what I said earlier, where I think that there's a different in not necessarily mindset, but I guess maybe just world perception between the East and the West.
Intention. Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
Capcom,
I don't think, I if Resident Evil would have been made by an American developer, I might have been more on the okay, this is kind of weird for Resident Evil 5. But coming from Japan, I don't think that they have the same preconceived notions or baggage that comes along with game settings like that. Or
I mean, yes and no.
But at the same time, I feel like that's the problem with setting games in real world areas. Obviously nobody was saying that anybody, I'm not saying that they didn't say this, but I think you'd be hard pressed to say that Capcom made Resident Evil 5 for nefarious purposes. Their intention was not to be a white guy shooting up Africa. That just happens to be where they set the game. But like I said, I think that's the problem when you try to set games in real life locations. Going back to Resident Evil 6 takes place with a viral outbreak in China, prophecy or, whatever. But again, setting that with that real life location, it's oh, well, now we've had several, major viral outbreaks come from China. So is that, that's I said, that's the problem. That's what I'm saying. That's the problem to me of setting games in real life locations is because, now China is forever connected to anything anything viral now.
A C virus outbreak in China.
Yeah. On top of that,
what are the odds? And it's
Capcom's got
unfortunate.
Capcom's got the Simpson writers over there writing some of these games.
I think time heals, most wounds. Or at least, the subject matter becomes a lot more discussion worthy. I feel like 9/11 was off limits for so long, and I feel like we're finally getting to a point where that can be implemented in media in certain selective ways. But yeah, I think I don't think setting Resident Evil 5 in an African location or any game in an African location in and of itself is a problem, but it needs to be a very informed decision with a lot of the key players, having the right to make, assertions on behalf of, the people they represent, right? I think it needs to be backed by, a strong education, talking to academic experts, historians about, we want to portray this setting. How can we do this in a thoughtful and respectful manner while maintaining the entertainment value of the game we're trying to make? Because I have a master's degree in international relations, and part of that did involve a lot of anthropological study. So it's very. I don't think it's hard to find the right people to talk to personally. So, I don't think there's a great excuse in 2021 anyway, to ignorantly portray like a certain group of people. Like, I just don't think there is any excuse, no matter where you come from, right?
Right.
Even if it's Japan or the West, I think the people who can give you the right answers are out there. And I don't think there's an excuse not to go seek them out. With Resident Evil 5 in particular, I do know that Capcom, the team went to Ghana for location scouting. So it's not like they didn't try. And I do know that one of the development members at the time did have a family member living in Ghana who, was instrumental in Capcom gaining the information that they needed early on in the project. So I do recognize that Capcom definitely did not go into it, recklessly, but obviously, given how sensitive the subject matter is, I think that, this needs to be a thing at game companies. If anything, there needs to be a person in a game company who comes from an academic background and can help either, inform the team about, sensitivity issues, or find the right people who can do that.
Yeah. Well, I would say that would be true of any medium. And I think,
Yes.
and while obviously you still want like movies to tell a good narrative, I do appreciate when movies go beyond like kind of surface level, like staying true to form. Like any movie can set itself in the 1940s and, use the right CGI or mock up the right buildings or mock up the right vehicles. But it's a different thing when they go in and actually kind of portray what things were like around that, or like a true to life experience, while you said, while retaining that entertainment value. So yeah, no, I wish games were, I think, a little bit more in that regard.
Absolutely. And, I hope we all make progress in that, in that sense. So.
Fantastic segue, Jesse, referencing original content, and of course I'm referring to the new adaptation of Resident Evil that's going to be hitting our screens in September. Alex, this wasn't even a thing last year when we last spoke. I would love to get your thoughts on the new Resident Evil movie. We've finally concluded the Anderson universe. It's in the rearview mirror now. We're pushing forward. We've been very, very vocal, Biohazard Declassified, in showing as many public shoots as possible to show people, yeah, they definitely are getting at least the locations right. And some of the tweets have been really promising. So, what are your thoughts on the new Resident Evil film?
Yeah, I look forward to seeing it. I think it sounds interesting, and I mean, I want to keep my expectations very much grounded, because video games and video game movies, I mean, I feel like they just come with a certain baggage, just can't really let go of, right? But before it just becomes its own thing, like where do you draw the line between Dino Crisis the movie and Jurassic Park, right? That kind of thing. So, yeah, I mean, I actually recently saw like a Netflix comedy with one of the actors for the Resident Evil movie, and like I think he did a great job. Like I think the talent is clearly there. I mean, maybe the talent has never really been the problem of the Anderson universe specifically, but so it really would, I would say, would fall on the director and the writer to make it interesting. And I think they seem to care about the material. Like if they know that Richard and Rebecca was a thing, I can't be all bad, right? So
overall, I mean, we can only go by what we've seen so far. Overall, from your end, pretty positive up until now. I suppose we're really going to know for sure when we see a trailer.
Yeah,
to the extent.
It's a crazy time for movies, though. So I really hope that it turns out to be really good.
I would like to put a spin on that, though, and say that there have been, I mean, since the first Resident Evil film, there have been positive adaptations. I mean, I appreciate Witcher was a book, but the Witcher series has been a very, very good game to film game to visual media adaptation. And yeah, I can't wait to see the film. Really can't.
Well,
What about you,
that's a
Jesse?
thing too, right? Like the
Yeah.
Netflix real or live action Resident Evil series,
Of course.
right?
Yeah. The one
Wesker
the
children.
one that the one that I think is probably the least hyped part of this year.
It's the one we know the least about too. So
And that's fair too. The only thing, like, I'm looking forward to seeing it, because I know Andrew Dabb is one of the showrunners that worked on Supernatural, and for the most part, I think Supernatural had a really good run. So I'm interested to seeing what he's going to bring to this new Resident Evil Netflix series. But at the same time, my biggest problem with it is, why give Wesker children when he already had a child that you've said nothing of? Like that, like, I know that's like a little weird thing, but to me, like, that's the biggest kind of like, okay, you haven't lost my interest, but I'm also trying to figure out why you're injecting something that already existed. Like, that was my problem with Alice in the Anderson films, was they injected this female lead into a series that already had female leads. It's like Alice could have been Jill, Alice could have been Claire, like Mila, I think could have portrayed either one of those roles probably fairly well, and Anderson could have still had his wife, steal the show like he wanted. But I don't think you needed to inject a character for that. I think you already had the existing characters there.
Yeah, I mean, I think Mila Jovovich is a great actress, and I just think she needs that one breakout role where she can actually show that to people. And unfortunately, after the first Resident Evil, I don't really think she got the chance to do that. I mean, I understand why they're doing the Wesker thing with this Netflix series, because obviously they need to have some kind of relationship with the universe. Otherwise, why use the IP? Right? I mean, how do you, I mean, that's what The Walking Dead is. It's basically Resident Evil without the Resident Evil characters or the virus in it. So if you're going to make a TV series about a zombie apocalypse, you have to have some kind of tangential relationship with the existing material. So I see why they're kind of going with this Wesker plot line. I mean, is it redundant? We'll see. I personally am not too worried about it. I mean, I'm trying to have this suspension of disbelief, when going into it, and I think that'll help me enjoy it more.
Yeah, I just it's like I said, and I mean, I guess maybe I understand why they didn't use existing characters, because obviously Infinite Darkness is going to be using Leon and Claire, and I think that's probably the best use of their characters. Like, I would rather see them continue on in CGI than I would live action. But again,
we're getting one of each style. We're getting like an extended universe thing. We're getting something that's directly related, and we're getting a reboot or reimagining. So I pick one that you like. There's three of them.
The only thing I'm mindful of is that is a lot. I mean, that's not including the 2 games that are coming out this year: Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil Reverse. That's a lot of media to come out in 1 year. My fear is that they're going to burn us out of Resident Evil. Like, they really need to either delay one of these or move them to the end of next year.
Well, and that's if obviously there's a lot of speculation about another Resident Evil game possibly slated for the end of the year. So you've got potentially 3 games coming this year, plus 3 film 3 set in stone film, some type of film adaptation of Resident Evil. So there is.
Alex, do you think we're going to get overexposed to Resident Evil potentially?
Wouldn't be the first time. It's happened twice already. So if it happened again, well, let the fire, raise everything to the ground, and then we rebuild it, I guess. Right. So it's cyclical. I mean, I find that there's a strange parallel between the first 4 years of Resident Evil and the last 4. RE 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica, RE 7, 2, 3, Village, right? And how the various games relate to each other and how they were developed. It's really uncanny almost, like
Well, yeah,
how we're kind of repeating the first 4 years in some ways. So
well, it's funny
right,
that
right down to the fourth game not having an official number on it, which is hilarious. So,
yeah, well, and it's funny that you say that too, because I always compare Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 7 together. Because to me, 7, and I know this is a very unpopular opinion to have, but to me, 7 is a reboot of the franchise with the first game. Both take place in a mansion. 7 fortunately got the first person treatment that Mikami wanted for 1, but they both take place in a very, very similar environment with very similar play styles, minus, obviously first person versus fixed camera. And then, like you said, going on to 2, 3, and now Village being set in a castle-like environment where you also have the castle-like environment from Code Veronica as well. Plus, like you said, they're not numbered titles, but still mainline entries. So it's funny, like the last 4 games actually mirror the first 4, or the last 4 games mirror the first 4 a lot more than we probably give them credit for.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's intentional myself, but it is really funny how that seems to have ended up to being the case, right? So, I mean, I'm not complaining, but it'll be interesting to see what happens after Village. If we'll see a Resident Evil 0 callback title come out starring Rebecca.
I don't know. I suppose this has become the beauty of Resident Evil. It's reinvented itself so many times, and so many different mediums.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I suppose we're just happy that we're getting. I truly believe 2021 is going to be the year of Resident Evil.
And actually, Andy, I wanted to add this because yes, we are getting a lot of Resident Evil media at one time this year, but I think this is the only year it works. I think just by nature of this being the 25th anniversary, the fan base and surrounding Resident Evil is expecting a lot. So Capcom has to deliver something for everybody this go around. And I think actually in the developer preview for Reverse, those exact words were actually used. About having to have something for everybody this year. So I think if this would have been like last year or even next year, I don't think it would work. But just by nature of it being the 25th, the quarter of a century that Resident Evil's existed, I think you kind of have to throw everything out. Like I don't know. And Alex, I actually want to hear your thoughts on this with the 25th anniversary literally being in 3 days for us, 2 days for you. Do you expect Capcom to have any kind of large announcements on Monday on the official day of the 25th anniversary?
Probably. Yeah. I mean, I think the 20th anniversary was the announcement of 4, 5, and 6 remastered. So I anticipate they say something about something.
I didn't even think about that. They did announce the 4, 5, and 6 remastered trilogy on the 20th.
Yeah, I mean, I tweeted about this a few weeks ago, but like Resident Evil 4 has been part of every anniversary that has come since its release, whether it was the 10th, 15th, or 20th, right, in some form. So I'm wondering if Resident Evil 4 will pop up again somehow in this.
My only thing is yeah, like that's the only thing is I know everybody's like, oh, RE4 remake then, and I pray to God that Capcom does not like. I'm, obviously, I think we've kind of all looked through the stuff that got leaked, and we kind of know without Capcom saying that 4 remake is definitely more than likely coming. It's at least in development, some stage of development. I don't want to see it this time around. Let's save that for a couple of years from now, I would say.
I'm not excited about that one at all because I have my own reservations about the idea of it. So I'll keep that to myself. But yeah,
But speaking of the 4, 5, and 6 remasters coming out on the 20th anniversary, there's been a lot of speculation of a 1, 2, and 3 remastered modern day release of the original ports. That to me would actually be really surprising to see. And they've already done a version of this, obviously, for the 20th anniversary with 4, 5, and 6. So I would like to see 1, 2, and 3 maybe, get modern like kind of like they did with Metal Gear Solid, like where they do it like through GOG or something like that.
Me too.
Especially because the lead up to the Resident Evil showcase is still really weird to me, where like I think with 5, 6, and 7 they used official assets, but with 1, 2, and 3 those aren't the official like they're reimaginings of the official stuff, and to me, like, it's like Capcom should know their IP. Like, I don't feel like they went on to Google and typed in like Resident Evil 2 item menu and found a GIF, like, but they obviously didn't pop in Resident Evil 2 into a PlayStation and game capture or something, or emulate it. Like, somebody hand built those new inventory screens from scratch to literally be used one time. To me, like, it's just weird. Like, I know that gets into like really conspiracy theory territory, but it's just weird that you would pay somebody to remake inventory screens for a 3-second GIF loop to use one time on Twitter. It's I'm holding out hope.
Maybe someone had to work at home one day and they didn't have anything else to do. I mean, that's obviously conjecture. I have no idea if that is an actual thing that could have been a thing, though.
Like I said, I just find it funny because I don't know, but I feel like Capcom sometimes does things to like build up expectation
and then disappoints people.
Yeah, like everybody was like, "Oh, this is definitely going to happen," and then it doesn't happen. So, I bet that's not just a Capcom problem. I feel like there's a lot of intellectual properties that do the same thing. Like, who was it? Was it Final Fantasy back a while ago hosted an event and really drummed it up, only to say that something wasn't happening?
Canceled. It was like the FF15 DLC. I remember.
Yeah. They made this huge big deal about it, and they're like, "Oh man, guys, you're not gonna want to miss this live stream. Like, you got to be there. It's gonna be huge." And then they're like, "Oh yeah, by the way, it's not happening."
Just on the point about RE4 remake, and it's something that's always brought up in my streams. About an RE4 remake, and I really compare this to the first Resident Evil remake in the fact that they managed to tell the story, but it also be something like 70% different. I really feel like there's nothing more they can say with the Resident Evil 4 story. Really, there's nothing they can't. If you're going to remake a game, you're not going to remake a game to make it worse. You're going to try and make it better. That's the whole. I would imagine that's the whole point of remaking an existing medium. You want to try something new. I just don't know what they can do with a Resident Evil 4. All right, okay, right. They can update the control system like it is in the modern Resident Evils. But aside from that, the narrative, it'll tell the same story. And I really feel like this is where Resident Evil 2 remake, as much as I loved it, really, 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 really kind of fell flat on, where it didn't tell that much of a different story compared to the expectation that was set with the Resident Evil 1 remake, where it had the Trevors and it had, a lot more backstory. I'd love to know your thoughts on that, Alex.
No, I agree. It seems that every remake we've gotten so far has had a very different degree of reinterpretation. You look at Resident Evil Remake 1 and then 2 and then 3, and like 3 just went off rails as far as I'm concerned. 2 is like somewhere in the middle where they didn't do much to introduce new information, but at least they didn't go off the rails like 3 did. So I mean, who knows, where another remake, the next remake being, I guess it's either 4 or Code Veronica, depending on these rumors. It's fascinating to see where they'll go. But I do like the remake 1 approach the best in terms of how they curate the content, to answer your question.
Yeah, which is actually an interesting point to bring up, because with the 4 rumors, I believe it was a VGC article that came out a couple of months ago, and I think we commented on it, was the M2 allegedly was in control of the Resident Evil 4 remake and was trying to make a more faithful adaptation to 4 than they did with Resident Evil 3. But, again, according to the alleged information, was that Capcom was like, no, we want more of a 3 remake style approach. And now Capcom has the project, and we're probably going to get more of a 3 remake versus a RE1 remake when it comes to 4. Again, like, that's the information that VGC had reported on. So it'd be really interesting to see that. But it was really, to me, the most interesting part of it was to hear that M2 internalized the fan feedback from 3 remake and was like, okay, fans don't like it when you go too off rails, so let's bring it back closer to home with the next one. And then Capcom was like, no, let's push it further away from the original, which I found very interesting, considering Capcom, when they internally developed RE1, did the opposite approach, where they definitely wanted to push further away from the existing narrative than one-to-one it.
Ooh. That's all I have to say about that. Ooh, right? I mean, if I have to give my honest opinion on the situation as it is explained in that article, I personally think it's a big mistake to change Resident Evil 4, even to the degree that it is that remake 1 was changed, because I think, based on my conversations with Mikami, I think he was very deliberate in how he made Resident Evil 4, and he purposely deprioritized the story of Resident Evil 4 because prioritizing the story had caused problems with the implementation of the Resident Evil 3.5 gameplay. And, the GameCube hardware at the time was unable to support, a gameplay system that would have given credence to the whole hallucination dynamic idea. And so Mikami, when he rebooted Resident Evil 4, he said, the story can't matter, because if it does, we're never going to finish this game. So, fuck the story, and let me just change the gameplay around. And he did. So if, they're going to go back and, try to, make the plot of Resident Evil 4 more significant than it has to be, I think, despite what Mikami might say about it, publicly anyway, I just don't think that makes sense, right? I think I think it's fitting a square peg in a round hole in a game that in many ways is probably perfect, the way it is. And, I think about all the Resident Evil 4 style games that Capcom has made since Resident Evil 4, such as RE5, Revelations 2, and none of them have come close to Resident Evil 4 in terms of the ingenuity of design or the compelling nature of the premise. And, we have other examples of remakes that are very faithful, but are also very well made, like Dark Demon Souls on the PS5 launch game. From what I haven't played it myself, but from what I hear, it is the same game with a new coat of paint. And
that's like Link's Awakening.
Link's Awakening, Shadow of the Colossus.
Mm-hmm.
There are some Pokemon games that I feel like are faithful remakes. Final Fantasy IV. And I feel like Ari can do with a remake like that. I think like I said, they have 3 different styles of remakes already. I feel like the 4th one could be a very faithful one and do very well. I don't think they should spend all these years potentially remaking a game that has a high possibility of being worse in the end, right? So.
Yeah, that's my only thing, because to me, RE4 more so than other games, and I think it's just because the nature of being built on a GameCube first in mind, because we tend to I tend to forget, at least sometimes, that 4, 5, and 6 all came out in the same console generation. And 4 aged the absolute worst out of all of them. 5 still looks good for its time if you remove the filter. 6 still looks relatively good for its time. 4 to me aged horribly, like style, or like not style, but like graphic quality.
Oh, I mean, RE4
and
was
even like the
generation
remasters.
RE5.
Yeah.
So, you know, I put 4 in the same generation as like Remake and 0. And yeah, even compared to those two, it did probably age the worst. So I mean, that's why, you know, like I said, I'd support a graphical remake, or, you know, that HD texture project is amazing. And
oh yeah,
now what doing great work. Right?
What that team is doing is exactly what I would want to see from 4 the most.
Exactly.
Now, my only other thing is, like, I love 4 to an well, I can't say that. No, let me backtrack. I don't love 4, but 4 is the game that I find myself playing the most. Like, somebody says what my favorite ask me what my favorite Resident Evil game, I will literally say everything but Resident Evil 4. But then I look at what game I go back to the most, and it's always Resident Evil 4. But
I've never met anyone who disliked Resident Evil 4 because it's like an unentertaining game, right? People usually have different problems with it.
My biggest problem with 4 is if they were to do a remake, I know, again, like, this is the most popular opinion, but I would like to see cuts in a 4 remake. I feel there are some areas of the game that just drone on way too long. Like, I like the action-packed focus of Resident Evil 4, but 4 tries to have its cake and eat it too in some areas. Like, they want it to be slow and methodical in some senses, but also fast-paced. And I think the pacing of 4 overall, along with not just the graphic design, but the pacing of 4 aged more poorly than 5 and 6. Like, 5, I think, structures action and like the slowness of the game well, where 6 is just an entire action romp the whole time. Where I feel like 4, they didn't really know how to do that balance. Like, they, there's some like the island, for example, like in my opinion, like the island could be cut down by a third, and I really don't feel like you would miss much. Like, I feel like there's some parts of that, or like even some of the castle segments where it feels unnecessarily long. And I think that was to like kind of clean the palette between action parts, but it ends up not portraying that. It ends up just feeling like, oh, there's a lot of nothing for no reason to me.
I mean, yeah, it is a long game. I do acknowledge that. I've never personally had a problem with the length of RE4. I think the pacing is impeccably good. And I think Resident Evil 5 is so poor in comparison when it comes to that particular point. I think, there are quality of life improvements they can make with RE4. Absolutely. When it comes to things like AI and, I think, if they remade it Blue Point style, they can get away with adding like moving and shooting. If they can, change the AI to behave accordingly while keeping the spirit of the original encounters. I think if they made it like Resident Evil 5 and 6, where you can choose whatever chapter you want at any time after you've beaten it, it might make replays a lot more palatable for people.
I would like that.
I think that would be. I think making those quality of life improvements would be a lot less offensive than cutting stuff out. Because after RE3, if you don't have a good reason to cut it, don't cut it, because you're bound to screw something up somewhere. And I'd rather they just stuck to the source material if they could. Yeah, so.
And I hadn't considered that. Like, it probably would do well. Like, you could probably fix a lot of the issues I have with quality of life updates versus actual cutting them.
Right.
Do we think that we're seeing? We briefly mentioned this earlier about how there are elements of Resident Evil 1.5 that were incorporated into RE2 remake. I actually forgot the biggest one, which was the Elsa Walker costume. I don't know why that escaped my mind, but they even included the Elsa Walker costume in the game. Do we think we are seeing elements of Resident Evil 3.5 in the various builds that it had in Resident Evil Village?
In Village? Possibly. Yeah, maybe. I would have been convinced it was going to be a no-brainer if it weren't for the fact that Village is actually a cross-generation title, because I think the fact that the Xbox Series X, the Xbox Series S, and the PlayStation 5 have very fast SSD solid-state drives in the hardware mean that, for the first time, that hallucination idea of instant world shifting can probably be, realized in a very convincing way.
Oh,
And I feel like we're finally at a point where we have the hardware that can do that. So I would have loved to see Village try to go for that. But the thing is, it's also on last gen consoles. So I don't know if that's an idea Capcom can really go too far into, but maybe another game can. So
well, that's like with Bloober Team's the game, The Medium.
yes,
It does
yes.
the real time world changing. So
Exactly,
the
yeah.
hallucination mechanic from 3.5 is definitely achievable with hardware now. So it would be interesting
Yeah.
to see that. But that would be my only thing if they truly make a Resident Evil 4 remake, like a 2 and 3 style remake. I would like to see if maybe they incorporated some of those 3.5 build ideas into the final game. Like obviously like 1.5's additions into Resident Evil 2 remake are more cameo than it is narrative building. Like, the shoot, like having the addition of the shooting range doesn't make or break the Resident Evil 2 or 1.5 experience. But I think it would be cool to see at least some of the locations from the 3.5, beta videos that we saw make their way into a Resident Evil 4 remake if it was to happen in a 2 or 3 style production. Because I think it's doable. Because I think the final aesthetic isn't that much off.
Yeah, that's true. I guess if they want to try, great, but it's an action-oriented Resident Evil game, so it just would feel a little too jarring if I had to imagine. But I mean,
well, that's why
maybe...
I said more like locations versus like maybe play style. Like I wouldn't want to see the hallucination mechanic in an action horror game.
I mean, now that I think about it, RE3 remake had that, right? Like with Jill's hallucinations and her becoming a zombie in her nightmare. I don't know. Maybe they can do something similar with Leon, where he's having like some nightmare and well, I mean, they did have a cutscene where he's dreaming about mutating, right? So I don't know. I mean, it's really hard to imagine for me personally, but if they want to try, we'll see how it goes.
No, the only reason why I said it really was obviously the use of a castle. The hook. I felt like the hook man in particular is very similar to that enemy that you encounter, one of the witches that you encounter in Maiden, and and I've seen him in some of the trailers where she just kind of appears and disappears. I thought that was very reminiscent of the hook.
Oh yeah, that's actually a really good point.
Good point. Yeah.
And even carries like the like in a scythe, which is like a hooked scythe on.
Come on, guys, come on. No, but yeah, you get what I'm saying. This is common. This is if we're using the same logic from 1.5 to 2 remake, they're getting to use some of the elements because I mean they're already starting to link the laws between Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 3. Is it that far of a push to say that they're going to try and link the lore between 8 and 4?
No, probably not. I would imagine they always do this, right? Like, even Code Veronica was, created as intentionally as more of a Resident Evil 1 sequel thematically and plot-wise even than it was as a sequel to Resident Evil 3. Well, even 2. So, yeah, they do this all the time where there's going to be a callback to some previous game. 5 was supposed to call back to Resident Evil 0 in some ways. We didn't really end up seeing too much of that in the end, but I think that was the intention. And what else? 6 kind of stood on its own. 7 kind of stood on its own. So yeah, maybe Village is finally the Resident Evil 4 sequel we all wanted. right?
Well, I mean, with them both
also
being
the
set in
items.
Europe,
The merchant,
yeah,
the
possibly.
item boxing.
They're on
Actually-
opposite sides, but yeah.
yeah. Actually, Alex, like you said something just then that I'm unfamiliar with, where you said that 5 was more of a sequel to 0.
Well, not a sequel. It was a sequel
Or-
to Code
or-
Veronica, but it was a lot of what was talked about in 0 was supposed to be was supposed to be important to the background plot of Resident Evil 5, like with James Marcus and how they discovered the progenitor virus. And I think Billy's little excursion in Africa might have had something to do with Umbrella, I think, as well.
Yeah.
So
see, now I think that would have been really interesting for them to have had it added in, where you had, maybe a file or something mentioning Billy, like, especially like knowing where, what he was involved with took place.
Also, Ouroboros, very, very similar to
Leech Man.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about that.
I think that was intentional. Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, I believe the Leech Man or the Swarm served as the foundation for some ideas in RE5 with the enemies, the Ouroboros. I remember reading that somewhere. I can't remember where.
I mean, it would make sense. Like, I guess the only difference would be Ouroboros wasn't able to retain a human shape where the leeches could.
Yeah.
But I guess, though, the ultimate trade-off of that would be that Ouroboros could perfectly fuse with a human and look like basically just be an enhanced human, where the leech would just be a collection of leeches that looked human, like wasn't truly human. So I guess they technically had their both humanoid forms in the end.
Well, they need their variety, so
yeah.
I can't wait till what haven't they done in the Resident Evil series that I feel like they should have done already?
That's a good question.
Yeah, we've fought actual humans. Have we fought any robots yet in Resident Evil? Like, no. No,
unless you count Krauser's drones.
Yeah, Krauser has his drones.
Or the Salazar statue.
Yeah.
That's probably on the chopping block for an RE4 remake, if I had to imagine. But who knows?
Yeah, no, I think robots maybe, now that we've got, I mean, obviously werewolves exist, I think, in some of the Marvel comics, Resident Evil, obviously non-canon entries into the franchise.
Witches and vampires.
Yeah, which
we have witches now. Yeah.
We have what we perceive as witches. Like that's the only thing is like, again, it kind of goes back to my argument, or like my, I don't understand the discussion of what makes a Resident Evil game. It still involves the enemies too, because it's like, well, unless it has zombies, it's not Resident Evil. And it's like, you realize how few games actually have zombies in it. Like, they have zombie-like enemies. 5, 6, 5 and 6 had versions of Lost Plagas. 6 had the what was it? C virus in 6 literally could just be whatever the hell it wanted to be at that time. Like, it could be a zombie maker, it could be a BOW maker, it could be an enhancement. It didn't know what it wanted to do. Then you had the Ouroboros in 5, you had the Ooze in Revelations, and then you had the T-Phobos in Rev 2. Like, Resident Evil has a wide enemy variety outside of zombies. So, and even with like 6 and 7 and Village, we're getting the perception right now that there's a supernatural element to it. And I have a feeling that this is going to go the same way as 7 did, where we perceive the supernatural, but we get a grounded Resident Evil universe biological explanation for what's going on. And I reference it's to be an in-game explanation, because the science of Resident Evil is obviously just complete horse shit in real life. Like,
oh yeah, yes. Especially now that we know how pandemics actually work
in
real life. Like all those characters need to be wearing masks. Hunk is the only one who could feasibly survive, right? Infection, right? Well, yeah, I know Resident Evil has one foot in the grounded biological basis, right, side of things, and it has another one, in the Silent Hill territory or the Fatal Frame territory of supernatural. So we'll see where things go. I mean, for me personally, nothing's off limits at this point, except I would say
Robots.
dinosaurs. But we had that one boss in Resident Evil 6 that was essentially a dinosaur. So yeah, nothing's off limits. Nope.
Yeah.
Invisible enemies, no problem. Yeah, it's
Which
crazy.
invisible enemies has been done several times, hasn't it? Or is it just the hunters in Revelations?
Revelations 2 had those spiky floating things.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, can never remember the name.
Over there.
Transparent enemies. RE4 did too. So those insects or those flying thingies, the bugs, yeah.
Which I feel like has been like a staple of almost every Resident Evil title to have like some weird bug creature.
Over enlarged bug, yeah.
Well, yeah, think about it. Like you had, to me, the chimeras are like the first generation of like the Drain Demios from 2, or the Brain Suckers, and 2 and 3, and then 4, comes out, and you have whatever the flies are there, and then 5 had a version of them too. Yes, at some point, I think.
I think that one Ouroboros spider. Well, spiders aren't insects. The more you know, right? They're arachnids, but I would call it a bug, just to be just to be clear. Yeah, like RE5 had that enemy, and remember when spiders were in Resident Evil games, guys? Anyway,
I completely retconned out of the remakes.
See, I don't like that's a change that I don't particularly mind. Like I don't like spiders don't bother me, but I don't think that they do anything to inherently enhance the story one way or the other. Like I've heard rumor that like the decision to take the spiders out of the remakes and later games was because they wanted more realistic based enemies or something, and then I've heard excuses of the RE engine being able to process spiders, and then I've heard Peter Fabiano just doesn't like them, or like I think the more plausible explanation is just arachnophobia is a big deal, and it's better to just not shut off like part of your game base because they might be scared to fight spiders. But honestly, at the end of the day, like the spider and the giant moth, like really didn't do any. Like I don't replay Resident Evil 2, to go fight the giant moth. Like,
I always skip that room anyway. So
so that's my whole point. Is like you don't go back and play Resident Evil 1 to fight the giant spider. Like there's many reasons to go back and play Resident Evil 1. Like I think you could remake. You can make Resident Evil 2 without spiders, but in the giant moth, but you couldn't remake Resident Evil 2 without Mr. X.
Well, we all thought you couldn't remake RE3 without the clock tower, and look where we are. So,
see, but I'm under the very small subsection of people where clock tower is my least favorite part of like Resident Evil 3. Like
that's not a good excuse, Jesse.
I'm just saying, like I was literally the only person that was like, oh my god, thank God no clock tower when it came out, and everybody else was like, fuck this game, no clock tower. And I'm like, oh shit, I better shut my mouth because I'm glad.
Yeah. They had one opportunity to have an atmospheric location with the usual Resident Evil exploration and puzzle elements in RE3, and they blew it. So
they did extend the hospital though. That was quite in depth.
They did. I mean, I actually really liked the hospital a lot. So that was really nice. But at the same time, yeah,
I didn't miss Gravedigger either.
Considering you can beat RE3 in under an hour, it just didn't really sit well with me that they cut that out.
Yeah, right? But I mean, you can beat the original in roughly the same time.
I mean,
Like,
the original game came out 20 years ago, so that's why, it I mean, there's a lot of disagreement here for sure, but like I don't
yeah,
like
no,
Resident
but
Evil games to be offensively short like RE3 was.
yeah, no, I mean, I kind of get that, but at the same time, like, I'm under the impression of, I think, obviously they cut a lot, or I won't say cut because I don't think that the intention was ever to have them in the game. I will say they excluded parts of the original. But I still think Resident Evil 3 would be under fire had it added. Like, had they made a longer game, I think the discussion would still be, this isn't Resident Evil 3. I think the majority of fans, when it came to a 3 remake, wanted an exact carbon copy. They wanted a Resident Evil 1 remake without the extra shit. Like, they just wanted Resident Evil 3 with new graphics. Because, I saw a lot of people say, well, why wasn't there a Carlos campaign? And it's like, well, there wasn't a Carlos campaign in the original, so you would have had to made up a Carlos campaign. And I think
agree.
the end argument would be the same. People would be like, oh, this is bullshit. Like, Carlos wouldn't have done this. Carlos wouldn't have done that. This doesn't make sense into the context of Jill's campaign. So, I mean, I think they were kind of between a rock and a hard place.
I mean, yes, I agree and disagree with that for many reasons. And I do recognize that what you did say, has a lot of validity to it. And obviously that's how the final game turned out. I just feel like not only was Resident Evil 3 Remake extremely short, but it was like devoid of anything, any specific thing you do in that game either feels like either they're phoning it in. It's like no one's creative juices were at their max, like with the Resident Evil 3 Remake. Like even like the memorable parts, like Carlos's hospital siege, like that felt like a cheap copy of the RE4 cabin scene.
But to be fair, I mean, that's a trope that Resident Evil has done almost in every title since 4, with the exception of 7.
And why add that to a game that didn't have it originally?
Sure.
And
no, that's fair.
Like the street campaign, like the Streets of Raccoon City and RE3 Remake. I mean, they were pretty cool. I liked the design a lot. Like, I didn't have a problem with the actual design, but it was devoid of what made exploring the city in the original RE3 so interesting, and what made it so different from the original RE3, so different from RE1 and RE2. We all know RE3 was originally a spin-off, so there wasn't going to be a lot of content in it that can be considered as meaningful as RE1 and 2, which is fine. But I felt like this was their opportunity to finally fix that. And I think they really, in that sense, I think they kind of dropped the ball. But which is unfortunate because RE3 got shafted in Umbrella Chronicles too. So it's not even really the first time RE3 got treated like that.
But the funny thing to me is I feel like a lot of the arguments, come from Resident Evil 3 being more similar from every other, like, obviously gameplay is not very similar, but literally all of the arguments surrounding Resident Evil 3 in 2020 are the exact same arguments surrounding Resident Evil 3 in 1999. The game was too short. A lot of, it's funny because I feel like outside of gameplay, like, this is literally 1999 that repeated itself. The original 3 was chastised for being too short of a game or feeling like a cash grab, basically being a holdover title. And I know a lot of people don't like to admit it, but that's the same thing that kind of, like, everybody that said that Resident Evil 3 Remake was a cash grab forgets the fact that Resident Evil 3 OG was kind of a cash grab. It was Code Veronica Code Veronica was taking too long, so let's throw a Resident Evil title out there.
Right.
I think one of the other thing was I heard somebody recently say is like, oh, you can tell that the team worked at M2 were a bunch of this was actually just a really weird conversation all the way around, because the person tried saying that all the people at M2 that worked on RE3 were newbies. And it's like, well, no, like, if you look at the production team of it, like, these are guys that go back all the way to Clock Tower. These aren't like new people in the gaming industry. And they're like, oh, well, what I meant to say was they were new with the RE engine. And it was like, yeah, like, but that doesn't make them new to the development scene. And to be fair, like, because I think in an interview, Peter might have called the team inexperienced or new, like the actual like coders or something.
That is a thing, you know.
But at the same time, Resident Evil 3 was also created by a very inexperienced team, and the only, you know, like what's his name? That was the director of Resident Evil 3.
The remake or the original?
Original.
Aoyama. Kazuhiro Aoyama.
Yeah, he was the only experienced person on that team. Like everybody else on the original 3 was brand new. Like this was like a trial run for them.
Pretty much.
So even the development cycles of Resident Evil 3, where you had the production, like the actual high level production team being industry veterans with a relatively new programming team, is even the same as the original game.
Sure. I think the biggest distinguishing element for me between the original Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and the remake is that I think the original punches above its weight in so many ways. There are a lot of things in that game that do not appear in other Resident Evil games, or that was the first game to introduce certain elements like the auto turn or climbing upstairs without pressing a button. Even Code Veronica didn't have this, right? And I think despite the fact that Resident Evil 3 was a little short and there was only one campaign, I do think that the team at the time, despite the fact that they didn't have a big budget, and it didn't start out as a numbered Resident Evil game, I felt like they made a lot of small but very interesting decisions to make Resident Evil 3 Nemesis really stand out. And even if you moved on to Code Veronica pretty quickly or whatnot, like there are still a lot of things about Resident Evil 3 Remake that made it really worth playing and really unique. And that's why I say like it punched above its weight. I mean, there are problems with the game. Like I think compared to Code Veronica, like RE3 has the thematic depth of a puddle, right? You know, like puzzles in RE3 have no depth to them whatsoever, which is a legitimate complaint. And I understand that wasn't the intention. But, you know, I just look at Resident Evil 3 Remake, and even as a filler title, it just doesn't do it for me, like on that basis. It just seems like the remake, you know, on the other hand, I feel like it undershoots its weight, right? It could have been such a heavy, you know, lifting title, but it's so, you know, hollow to me that like it'll float if you make it hold a balloon.
My only thing with that is, like, from my perception of it, is I feel like 3 Remake only feels more hollow to the original because we feel like the original gave us more freedom than it actually did. Like the choice mechanic. Like I know everybody was like, where the hell is the choice mechanic? And while I'll admit in 1999, the choice mechanic was a cool thing to see, but after you play the game like 2 or 3 times and you realize that no matter what choice you make, basically the same game happens every single time. Is there really a need for the choice mechanic? Like I actually, in his Avalanche reviews it, RE3 retrospective, and I think he said it beautifully when he was like, do you really go back and play the original RE3 to jump down a hole or to jump out of the hole? I mean, because at the end of the day, the same choices are made, whether you fight Nemesis in the restaurant or you fight him in the newspaper office. The end goal is the same. And like literally the cutscenes play out the exact same with a different background. Like that's about the only difference in that Nemesis fight.
I feel like that's just starting a domino where if you ask yourself, why do you replay Resident Evil games? And, you know, no one's answer can never be good enough in that sense, right? So I feel like
mind their damn business.
I mean, you know, the choice selection feature was in one game. It didn't make it to other Resident Evil games because probably it wasn't, you know, a great feature that could go from title to title. I agree with that. But if you're going to remake the one game that did have it, you know, I feel like in order to make that game stand out, especially with the hindsight of 20 years of, you know, progress in game development, like I'm not convinced that they couldn't come up with something more interesting. Like I think
that's fair.
I think, you know, I don't want to make accusations about, you know, how much effort people put into any game, but like I will say it was probably a mistake to remove that on top of everything else that got removed. If they kept a lot of other stuff but removed the live selections, I don't think it would have stood out as much. But the fact of the matter is, we can be consumed in a conversation about what was cut in Resident Evil 3 Remake. And I think that just speaks for how that game has turned out, right? We're not talking about the stuff they added. Like you talk about Resident Evil 1 Remake, you can have a 3-hour podcast about what we added in, right?
Yeah, but I think that's the thing that I guess bothers me about it is I would say 2 suffers all of the same flaws as 3 did. But because 2 had multiple campaigns, it gets a pass from the community at large.
Mm.
Like
and I
that,
don't think they're that different, really.
That's the whole thing.
It's more of a director's cut.
Yeah, I think 2 and 3 Remake all suffered the same problems, but 3 is an easier conversation to have than 2 is, because I don't think people want to ever criticize Resident Evil 2, either the original or the remake. I don't know what that is, but
I mean, a lot did change in Resident Evil 2, but I think the difference between Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil 2 is that I think the changes that were made in RE2 were very interesting. Maybe you didn't like it as much as the original. That's fair. But you can't tell me that Nest 3 or Nest 2 was an adequate replacement for the Dead Factory in the same way Nest 1 was an adequate replacement for the lab in RE2, right? I feel like there are very different degrees of how you can change things around. And I feel like RE3 Remake really didn't. I mean, I can't. I'm really trying to think. Was there anything that was in RE3 Remake and also in the original that was more interesting, or that the replacement was? And for me, Nest 2 isn't. The hospital, yes. I would say the hospital.
What about the power station where you have to flip the switches?
Okay, yeah, we'll give it that too.
Different.
Power station was good.
I would say, honestly,
hospital.
I know a lot of people don't like the Nemesis mechanic of 3 Remake, which, again, I feel like people over glorify how the AI in the original was. I don't think Nemesis in the original was as good as people remember it being.
He's not. But it just goes back to what I was saying. People. Resident Evil 3 punches so far below its weight that people can forgive those problems. And they don't realize those are actually problems. People don't realize Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was the cheapest Resident Evil game up until that point, right? People don't realize that because they disguised it so well. It's like making a birthday cake out of cookies or something, right? You enjoy it, because you made it, under the circumstances that you did, right? And I don't think there was anything that forced Resident Evil 3 Remake to intentionally try to do the least amount of work as possible, right? Or to offer the least amount of content. And that's really why I'm a little hard on the game, even though I like it. I would love to meet the creators one day and really, get their perspective on how they came to release the product that they did, and maybe I'll change my mind.
Well, wasn't wasn't one of the lead producers of 3 the main programmer on the original?
Yep,
if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, the director.
He was literally. Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think the director. Is he the director or one of the producers? But I will say though, I think even if you don't like the mechanic of Nemesis or the scenarios they set up for Nemesis in the remake, to me, Remake's Nemesis is way more of a compelling boss than the originals. I understand I understand people don't like his look, and I will admit that I get where they were coming from, and I actually appreciate the style of the trash bag Nemesis look, I guess I should say. I understand it's a prototype. He's wrapped in a protective plastic thing instead of an actual. Because people forget Mr. X was a development, or he was a full in development bioweapon. They had Mr. X trench coats and shit ready to go. They dressed every single one of them that way. Whereas Nemesis was a one of the kind creature at the time. So I understand why he would look more developmental, and I appreciated that.
I love the design. For
I would
sure.
say
I agree with
his
you.
alt, like his secondary forms and stuff, were way more compelling than the originals. Like,
See,
Uh,
like
Yeah, I
Final
dunno.
Nemesis in the original, like, is dumb. Like, it's a fucking slug, and I don't like it. Like, I find that
The
I
end
don't know.
boss,
It's just
the end boss was better, but I
yeah,
think
no, yeah.
the subsequent, the ones before, just they
I think
paled in comparison.
what's missing is they transition from first stage Nemesis to the liquor like Nemesis too quickly. I think
No,
I think the clock tower area in Remake 3 should have been a different boss. Like, I think it should have been like a more humanoid Nemesis fight there, and then the liquor Nemesis come in the
Yeah.
test facility towards the end of the game. I think that was the only letdown with me, was they needed one more version of Nemesis in there.
Resident Evil 3's bosses, the remake's boss fights were really good. Like I would have loved to have like a boss theater mode where you could just fight the bosses. Like it's
Like,
totally
especially
great.
like the first, like the final Nemesis fight right before the end of the game. Like, the railgun in it is obviously kind of like immersion breaking, because like
It's huge.
you fire a railgun that cracks the floor around you, but
Right.
doesn't tear
Kill
your
you.
arms off. But the way the soundtrack hits at the moment that she pulls the railgun off, like the Metamorphosis track there, is so fucking beautiful. Like,
if there's something that
It's-
RE3 remake demolishes the second remake, and it's the music.
oh,
I would
100%.
say.
The
Like,
remake
without a
sound,
doubt.
the remake
Without a doubt.
soundtrack of the original hits so much better
Really,
than the low gravelly
really
tones
well
of 2
done.
remake.
really well done. I would say though, like on the Nemesis bit, if Mr. X and RE2 remake weren't a thing, I think it might have been okay how he was portrayed in RE3. But the grand irony is that Mr. X's behavior in RE2 remake, to people's perceptions, is more similar to how Nemesis behaved in the original RE3, and that's why super scripted Nemesis, obviously scripted Nemesis, same exact location encounters every time in the remake might have come off as more disappointing to people.
For sure.
Yeah,
Something that I did that was I could be having some serious Mandela effect here. As I start to wrap this podcast up, one thing that we picked up very early on in the in the Resident Evil 3 like build up was an apparent fast travel system, and it never got mentioned again.
I think that might have just been somebody
Well, so it was
providing wrong information, right?
Yeah, so there was an IGN and I think a Game Radar Plus article that came out right after, like, it was right after the embargo ended, around the same time that who was it, Game Jolt or whoever it was, got all of their or Game Gen got all of their press photos leaked out on not Tumblr, what was it, that picked Imgur or
Imager.
however you say it. Yeah, Imager. All of their like hidden press photos got leaked out. But yeah, there was an IGN, like I said, I think a Game Radar article that came out that was talking about a fast travel system and being able to use the subway. And it's always confused me because like they did play a build of Resident Evil 3 during those press outlets. And I always wondered if that was, they might have been talked about like being in development at one time and scrapped, and it was just a misunderstanding, or people like oh, I'm in a subway and I know I have to go to a subway station, and they saw the plaque in the subway station where the computer terminal where you can change the inputs, and maybe they thought like they were going to be able to explore the city that way, and that just wasn't the case in the end game.
If I remember correctly, there might have been like a beta version of the game where you can select different areas of the map that you can access, and maybe somebody thought that was supposed to be in the final game, which I understand, because if you try to do one of the two puzzles in the game, which involves, choosing the right train route. Maybe they thought that was supposed to unlock some kind of traversing feature, or maybe somebody mistranslated an explanation. I mean, it happens all the time.
That's kind of what I got from it, because when you do the train puzzle, there's still like what looks like a secondary route you can pick that's not blocked. Like, it's not the correct route, but it's also not blocked to where you can actually go to the end, if I'm not mistaken, or you can get further along in it. So I've always wondered that, where if somebody just saw that plaque in the Kite Brothers train station and was like, oh, here's a track selection thing, maybe I can go to different places or not.
Well, that's like the other disappointing thing. Like, I wish they had kept that in the game. Because one, surviving a train wreck is extremely unlikely in a lot of scenarios, but it seems to happen a lot in Resident Evil. It would have been nice for Jill to take the train back after, the hospital and go see if Dario survived. Like, even that got taken out of the remake, right? Small things like that.
Just
that
an unnecessary fucking interaction at the beginning.
The one thing that I think was the biggest letdown for me when it came to like the train was the survivors.
Oh,
yeah, it sucks to be them.
Yeah,
like, it's like they get shown in a cutscene. You can peer through the train window and see them, and you're like, oh, like, am I gonna find like more people like to shove into this fucking train car? And it's like, oh no, like those are just like random NPCs that you will only see this one time, and then they're dead.
If they added, for example, this Dead Rising like thing where you could find survivors and get items or weapons or whatever by bringing them back to the train, like, that would have offset the lack of a choice system for me, for example, right?
Yeah, because like it's like they almost committed to that with the new train puzzle where you got the gems and put it in and you got extra things. Like, they wanted to keep giving you a reason to keep coming back to the train station before you actually had to.
Right.
But it's like,
nope.
Why don't do that as a puzzle? Like, because you see live NPCs running around the street at some different points. It would have been nice to, be like, hey guy, like, go to the train. Like, obviously they would have probably all died anyways, but at least pretending like you did something good for a little bit would have been a nice addition.
Would have been a very Dead Rising like mechanic, which would have been fun because they're not making Dead Rising right now, I think. So anyway, well, I didn't mean for this podcast to become an indictment on Resident Evil 3 Remake, unfortunately. I mean, I still like the game a lot, but yeah.
Well, Alex, it's certainly been a pleasure bringing you on today.
Likewise.
As ever. We've had again, it's been an education, and I always love deep diving into Resident Evil, as you know. Obviously, your book's coming out. The ebooks published by Unbound. It's going to be available in Walmart, Booktopia for the Aussie fans, Waterstones in the UK, so that's amazing stuff. Have you got a couple of release dates in mind for the hard copies, etc., etc.?
I think hard copies should start going out to people very soon. I imagine if you're in the UK, you would be the first to get them because that's where they're manufactured and shipped from, followed by, people in Europe, continental Europe, I hope. I know there are shipping problems right now because of Brexit and whatnot. And, COVID slowed down international shipping. But I think people should be getting their hard copies by April at the latest. I signed all the book plates, like these stickers, very recently. And those were returned already to the publisher. So those should be shipped out to people very soon. I think the official release date for general release is April 15th. And
is that for digital? Because for both? Because for some reason July comes to mind.
Like all the non-UK Amazon sites say July, so it could be July. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what Amazon's policy is for moving up release dates, but it could maybe get moved up because I know it's April 15th on the UK Amazon site. So, I mean. Bear with us, given what's going on, but we're going to try to get it to you all out as soon as possible. And as a concession prize, the ebook comes out on the 22nd of March, probably UK time again. So I think
is that for general release or is that
Backers
Just
only.
the backers only. Yeah, that's what
But
I thought.
you can. The thing is, you can technically still back the ebook on Unbound, and I think that will qualify you for a March 22nd release. I think. I mean, we're 2 days out, so I'm not 100% sure, but that was the official answer as of a few days ago.
Well, if you want to pick up the ebook, we've got it pinned in the comment section. We're going to have it pinned on the podcast when we release it as a video on demand. Obviously it goes without saying the Itchy Tasty, stupidly ambitious book. It's going to give a very, very unique insight into the Resident Evil universe. This has never been seen before, and from both here at Biohazard Classified, we cannot wait to get our hands on it. It's going to be awesome. We're definitely going to be running some articles on it.
Yeah, Alex.
Sorry.
Alex. Before we go, do you have a little snippet or a little maybe excerpt from the book that you'd like to share or talk about real quick, just to give people an idea of what's to come?
Well, I mean, I could if I pulled up the book, but the thing is, I'm actually doing a live reading.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, with Carcinogen SDA.
Not necessarily a live read, but just that's going to happen at 12 a.m. March 22nd JST. I forget what the times are in other regions. Let me pull up my tweet really quickly so I can reconfirm. I think people should know, because I think it'll be pretty exciting, and I do have a lot of things to say there. It'll be March 21st, 11 a.m. on the U.S. East Coast, 8 a.m. on the West Coast, and 3 p.m. If you're in the U.K. So, but yeah, in terms of excerpts, there's so much stuff. It's hard to pick unprompted. Maybe I can't really read off something, but I do say that I think the Resident Evil Outbreak chapter is something that people are going to like a lot. It's something that's been rarely discussed. Things like, why wasn't there voice chat? Why did the series get discontinued? They wanted to put the Outbreak games on PSP at one point, but they chose to do Monster Hunter instead, which is particularly fascinating, seeing where Monster Hunter ended up going after. So yeah, we're less than 2 days away, so just a bit more patience, and hopefully I look forward to hearing what everybody has to say. I'm almost afraid that it'll actually disappoint people because it's taken this long for it to come out, but I hope not. I'm
sure it won't.
No, it's great stuff.
Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. It's been an absolute blast. And from us here at Biohazard Classified, and from, Alex, you can find him at CVX Freak on Twitter. Is it?
Yep.
Alex?
That's where I am.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And don't forget that. Oh, sorry, Eddie. Don't forget that you can also catch Alex tomorrow, technically, at 8 a.m. I'm trying to convert my time. 8 a.m. my time. Correct?
It's 11:30 a.m. here, so I guess we would start.
It's Sunday.
It's 11:59 p.m. is technically tomorrow here. So yeah.
Tell you what, set your Twitch alert to Carcinogen SDA, and then whenever it goes live, just set an alarm.
Oh yeah. I'm sure you guys will love the live reading. I can't wait to read this out loud. And then the ebook should drop a few hours after that. We also have a little bit of a surprise at the end of that stream as well, that you two are probably privy to because you participated. So hopefully that goes out at the right time.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alex.
Cool.
We'll see you all soon.
It was a pleasure, guys. I hope we have another chance to talk again soon. And thanks to your audience as well for tuning in tonight.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Brilliant.
Alex.
All right. Thank you so much.